Note that we have interpretation services this evening available in Spanish. And will the Spanish interpreter please raise her hand and introduce herself? Would you please introduce yourself en español? Okay, thank you, and gracias. Tonight's hearing is being broadcast live on Boston City TV, as well as on YouTube, Comcast Channel 24, RCN Channel 13, and FiOS Channel 1962. It will be rebroadcast at a later date. If you'd like to speak this evening but have not yet signed up, please see our staff person, Ms. Lena Parvex, in the hallway. Sign up for public comment on all public comment options this evening. Will close at 6:30 p.m. In a few moments, Chief Financial Officer Eleanor Lawrence and Deputy CFO Nate Cooter will provide us with the interim superintendent's revised FY20 budget proposal. But first, I'd like to turn it over to interim Superintendent Perrill for comments.
Thank you, Chair Lecanto. Good evening, everyone. Some of you may have noticed it was a little more crowded than usual getting into tonight's meeting. I want to begin by thanking everyone for coming out tonight and expressing your thoughts and concerns about the budget. As many of you know, the budget is truly a process. It's an ongoing public dialogue that involves input from the students, parents, teachers, staff members, and community members we work so hard to serve. I'd like to thank all of you, as well as members of the school committee and our elected officials, for continuing to ask pointed questions that make us think deeper and more strategically about how to best serve our students with the resources we have. As our CFO, Eleanor Lawrence, will shortly explain, we've worked extensively with school communities throughout the budget process. She will share that we were able to add nearly $3.2 million to the budgets of 53 schools in FY20. This is on top of our original budget proposal that was made last month. Another step forward was the recent announcement by Mayor Walsh in the City of Boston that we're providing free MBTA M7 passes to students in grades 7 to 12 for next year across the city. This is an investment that students and youth leaders have been asking about for years. The distribution of M7 passes allows all of our students to not only get to and from school, but it increases their opportunities to attend internships, after-school programs, dual enrollment classes at area colleges, and career technical training jobs and more. So we are thrilled about this news. I'd like to thank the BPS Budget Office for its prudent fiscal planning and for helping us to find funding in reserves to provide additional supports for our schools with declining enrollment, along with special education supports and supports for our lowest performing schools. Again, these funds are being allocated on top of our original budget proposal from last month. We always want to thank Mayor Walsh and the City of Boston for being our partners in this process and for stepping up to make additional investments for our students, making up for what the state aid has lagged behind. We welcome our student leaders and voices as well. We're pleased tonight to be hearing from members of the Hyde Square Task Force and the Boston Teen Arts Coalition, part of a constructive dialogue showing their enthusiasm to establish a plan for further dialogue to advance the district's ongoing efforts to expand arts opportunities for more students. Everyone in this room has a desire to see the students of the Boston Public Schools be successful. That is our shared goal and our shared mission. I'm thankful to all of you who are here tonight as we work to provide the best possible use of our resources for our students. And with that, I'll turn things over to CFO Eleanor Lawrence.
Thank you, and good evening, school committee members. I want to join Superintendent Perrill in thanking our community, thanking our school committee members. Tonight marks the 5th school committee meeting or budget hearing that we've had since February 6th. We appreciate the voices of everyone who's been part of this process. And I think in some of the changes that we're going to discuss tonight, you'll see reflected community voice, not just from the last 2 months, but voices that we've heard over the last few years. If the committee could humor me for a moment, I would also like to do a few other thank yous as developing a budget that is $1.3 billion involves the hard work of many, many people who you have not seen at the front table over the last 2 months. We have 50 central departments who all worked on their own budgets with support from our budget team, as well as 125 schools who came to bowling and did the important and hard work of creating their own budgets. Thank you to our central departments and schools. We have 3 teams within finance that all contribute to budget development. Jamie Racconelli leads planning and analysis, which does enrollment projections, which starts the process. Anu Giant leads our grants and external funding team. And I'm going to ask the budget team and Anu, who I think are here tonight, to stand up while I recognize you by name. David Bloom leads the budget team. And the team includes Yvonne McCrae, Cynthia Beltray, Chris Williams, Luna Agoro, Allie Slate, and Charles Page. Thank you all for your hard work. My remarks tonight are going to be brief. The goal of tonight's conversation is for Nate and I to update you on the changes reflected in the FY20 proposal versus our original proposal on February 6th. Those changes are summarized in the memo that was distributed today. It's printed and available on the tables outside, and it's on our website with all of the updated information that reflects our budget. There's also a new series of detailed budget tables available on the website. Superintendent Perrell noted a number of the major changes reflected in the budget. Notably, we have allocated out soft landings for our lower performing schools. That was a reserve we had discussed with the committee of $1.3 million that was in our original proposal. In addition, thanks to the hard work of our student enrollment and engagement teams, we have completed some of the assignment for rec students. And so as those students have been identified, the receiving schools, we have adjusted the WSF for the receiving schools in the amount of $1.3 million. There were a number of other smaller changes to school budgets. For instance, updating allocations of our coordinators of special education and other special education supports. As Superintendent Perrell mentioned, across all of the areas of change for our school budgets, the school budgets increased by $3.2 million since February 6th's original proposal, and 53 schools saw increases. In the detailed budget tables distributed today, there are also a few quite minor changes to central office departments. Those do not represent material changes to our budget proposals, but some transfers between central office departments and small reorganizations. On the subject of M7s, because negotiations are still ongoing with the MBTA, we have not reflected the change in our budget. We are quite confident in conversations with the city that we will be able to afford it without having to make any other trade-offs in our budget, but we are going to wait until negotiations are done for that to be completed. So with that, I'd love to turn it over to the school committee for any remaining questions, and thank you again.
Well, thank you, Ms. Lawrence, and thank you, first of all, for recognizing the hard work of your team. It's always a Herculean task that really is throughout the year. We only get you for 2 months of the year, barely, when we have our annual budget hearings, but certainly the work is deeply appreciated by all of us, and so thank you very much once again for putting in the extra effort here. And, you know, I think we mention it on an annual basis, and certainly at each one of the hearings that we have, but the work that the Budget Office does specifically in the Office of Finance with respect to putting together such a comprehensive budget that attends to the needs of our students and our schools is deeply appreciated as well.
Thank you.
So I know that we've had a number of opportunities over the last few months for members to ask questions, and certainly in hearings, at meetings, and offline as well. So I want to suggest to my fellow members that any questions right now will be relatively brief, because I know we have a number of folks that are waiting to testify this evening, and we will have the regular meeting that will follow the budget hearing as well. So with that, I want to open it up to my fellow school committee members for questions and discussion. Ms. Robinson.
Thank you. Thank you for the information about both the soft landings and the schools that received additional funds. So between those two buckets of money, did all of the schools that had seen cuts get something back? Maybe not everything they needed, but got back something.
That is a good question. I'd have to look at our tables. I think the majority of our schools that experienced budget declines had some sort of additional funding available over the last 2 months. I cannot pretend to say that every school's request can be met perfectly. We still certainly have schools that had to make hard trade-offs to balance their budgets for next year, and I certainly want to acknowledge that.
Okay. For a number of years, we've used the weighted student formula as the main way that we go about looking at school budgets. But we've also, many years, have talked about, quote, schools with declining enrollments. And that is something that we're seeing citywide that continues to impact schools. And sometimes I feel unfairly to say that the schools are experiencing declining enrollments when 1,000 people leave the city for other reasons. Yeah. So the issue is, as long as we have all of our schools, we need to figure out a way of not penalizing those who remain behind, who still need a full education. So I'm hoping that there'll be a way, in addition to the weighted student formula, as we move forward, that we can look at the impact of declining enrollment so that it doesn't continuously hit at the incredible programs that schools need to exist to support the students that they have.
Thank you for those comments. I strongly agree. I hope you have seen reflected in the budgets of the last couple of years that we do not consider WSF a static or fixed mechanism. We hear feedback and we have made some fairly significant changes, and we're not done trying to improve it. Having declining enrollment in certain neighborhoods, program areas, is hard no matter what mechanism you use to distribute funds. So even if we were operating in a world of a staffing formula, those kind of enrollment shifts would put pressure on some schools. In order for us to serve the growing need in some other schools and neighborhoods, we have to make trade-offs. But we hear you loud and clear, and we will continue our work over the spring and summer to think about additional changes that we can make next year to continue on what I hope has been some progress on that front.
Right, thank you. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Ms. Robinson. Mr. O'Neill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Ms. Lawrence, for your presentation. 2 quick comments. One, could you step me through, please, the rationale of the soft landing for the Blackstone in particular? And, you know, just as an example of how you approach soft landings, you listed 6 or 5 in the memo. But if you could help me out with the Blackstone, just as an example, and it's obviously one we've heard quite a bit about. And quite frankly, you know, Blackstone in particular is a school that jumps out to me that deals with many of our most vulnerable youth. And so, I obviously have always stayed a particular sensitivity to that population.
We agree. As I've mentioned, the Blackstone is unique this year amongst all of our schools in the nature of the challenges we faced due to the change in its innovation status that put it in a unique position with budget challenges. I'm going to let David Bloom, our budget director, talk about the soft landing allocation.
Good evening. There are 2 main considerations that go into the allocation of soft landing funds. One is any change in overall budget of the school, and the second is a change in FTE. Looking at both of those is important because sometimes, as in the situation at the Blackstone, their budget, I believe, is actually going up if you look at the dollars allocated to the school for next year, but the number of FTE is decreasing due to the situation about the change of status. So the process we go through is we look at budget changes and FTE changes, and essentially schools get put into buckets of impact and then get allocated staff or non-personnel funding that they could use for staff if they'd like, based on the degree of challenge that they're facing. So the net result for the Blackstone was an allocation of an additional 1 FTE. They then looked through that, and I believe they decided to add back somebody focused on special education inclusion into their budget.
Okay. So that would be specifically, inclusion, not for the substantially separate students that they have.
No, there's the only change for the substantially separate program, I believe, is we're expecting one fewer class in the school in its entirety. So there's a reduction of staff associated with one fewer class.
Okay. So thank you for paying attention to that. I do ask that we continue to keep looking at that as other reserve, if in fact some other reserves come available. One other quick point I want to make, I continue to feel that the wait list issue that was raised by the Hale parents and is exemplified at other schools around the district is a key issue. And if we're not getting folks off a wait list in time for the October 15th cut, maybe we should both look at ways to get students off the wait list faster into a school of their choice if seats are available, to make sure by the time we do a count, it's as accurate as possible for where people want to end up for the year, including if, and I know Ms. Lawrence and the team, October 15th is probably the latest you can go to be able to start the budget cycle, but the longer you can push that, the better it is, in combined with trying to get as many folks off the wait list as possible. And the last point I wanted to make was, I know we have a lot of students here today, including a number of high school students, and I hope folks have really heard loud and clear what the district and the city have done to get M7 passes for all of our students, including all the private parochial and charter students as well. And if anyone ever doubts the power of BSAC, and Ms. Reyes, right, it has probably been the top issues that BSAC has been advocating for the past couple of years, and has made it very clear to this committee and to city officials the value of that M7 pass. Not only how some students choose schools because of having it or not having it, maybe going to one a little bit farther beyond so that they could get it, so they have it for jobs, et cetera. The power of BSAC was very powerful in this, so I thank you and your colleagues for advocating on it so fiercely, and I hope the rest of the high schools appreciate the work that your BSAC reps are doing on your behalf. So, that's for BSAC. And thank you, Superintendent, for hearing that message from them and making that happen. That's all from me, Mr. Chair.
Well, thank you, Mr. O'Neill. And first of all, thank you very much for highlighting the good work of the Boston Student Advisory Council on the M7 pass, as well as a number of other important issues. I know we're going to be talking about city finances and school financing reform a little bit later, and BSAC has been active with a number of other youth organizations organizing on that front in support of the Promise Act. So your advocacy knows no bounds, and we deeply appreciate it. I also want to thank you, Mr. O'Neill, for once again raising the issue of accurate student counts, enrollment counts, and you know, as we've talked throughout this process, I think it is wise for us to come back at some point later in this semester before the school year lets out to talk a little bit more about that process, educate the community, educate ourselves about how that process works, and look for whether there are any efficiencies to be gained so we can have as accurate of a count as possible. So thank you for keeping that at the fore. Vice Chair Oliver Davila.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I also want to say thank you for all your work. I know that you don't get as much recognition because of the work that you're doing, and obviously its impact, which can be good and not so good. So I just want to say thank you, because I can imagine how much work, and thank you, everybody. I also want to thank the mayor, and not just BSAC, because I think there were a lot of other youth organizations that worked on the M7s, and also Mr. O'Neill, who's never going to like to be recognized, but he also played a big part. So people before us that have really worked on the M7, I can't stress enough how important that the M7s are for young people, not just during the school year, but during the summer, to not just go to school, but also be able to get to work and get to after-school programs. So I just am really, really excited. And on a selfish note, I can take that line out of my budget, which is great, because then I can spend it on things like food for students that come to our program. So thank you. I also just very quickly, Mr. O'Neill talked about two of the points that I wanted to also talk about, which is the enrollment piece and really getting students off the wait list and figuring that piece out. And then not just the Blackstone, but I think for the future is the turnaround and status change of Innovation School, and how do we figure that piece out? I know that goes beyond us as well. As the chair mentioned, we are looking at a new funding formula legislation. And for those of you that are here, because if you're going to leave right after this budget hearing, it's an opportunity on Friday morning at 9 o'clock. There is a state education meeting around this funding formula. So I really encourage everybody to go and really talk about the impact of the Promise Act and what it would do for not just our schools, but schools across the district, looking at poverty and looking at our population. So please, if you can go, if you can't go, call, write a letter, etc. But I wonder how we can plan for schools that are changing their status. So just thinking about in the future, you know, if it's getting external corporate partners that can step in and help, I don't know, but I just think that when I look, and you know, Blackstone's not the only school that has faced that, but when I look at that, you know, that's really, really just a really hard blow, even if you know that it's coming. So, and then that's it. That's all I want to say. So those are my points. Thank you so much for all your work.
Well, thank you, Madam Vice Chair. And I want to take a moment. You make a good point in noting for our audience, folks that might not be staying beyond the budget hearing tonight, to hear the presentation from the city on state education funding reform. I want to reiterate that the city has been very out front on advocating for the Promise Act and needed education funding reform around Chapter 70. Outside, you might want to pick up a few items. One is I want to direct your attention to a letter that the mayor has authored to community members today. Members, it's in all your packets, and it's been distributed online, and we're happy to I'll be happy to tweet that out later if anyone else wants to take a look at it. But it gives you a little bit of a sense of what it is that we're up against here. If you have an organized group and you are looking for very simple explanations of what the Promise Act is and what the budgetary impacts it might have on the city are, certainly contact our office. You can contact Ms. Sullivan in the school committee office, as well as the superintendent's office. I'm sure we'd be able to find the appropriate people to get you to those very simple explanations. I believe we have them in multiple languages that we can distribute out to you and to your groups. And as Ms. Oliver Davila said, you know, Thursday is one of the first hearings on this bill. I believe it's actually at 10 a.m. You might want to check online before you head down there, just to be safe. But you should. Friday, I'm sorry, I did say.
Friday at 9.
It is 9 or 10?
Okay, well, it's Friday. I thought
Okay.
it was 9, but it could be 10.
All right, we'll figure it
Definitely
out.
Friday.
I would strongly suggest that you check with the Joint Committee on Education, which is a collaboration between the House and the Senate up on Beacon Hill for the specifics on that hearing. And if you can't attend that hearing, it's important that you call your senators and your state representatives in Boston. We have 23 of them, and so they comprise a very strong block within the 140 representatives and senators that we have on Beacon Hill. And if we can get them aligned to advocate for change, then we can make some meaningful progress here. I would also suggest that if you're going to write in, you would direct your comments to the co-chairs of the Joint Committee on Education. On the House side, that is Representative Alice Peisch, P-E-I-S-C-H, from Wellesley, and on the Senate side, we have a new co-chair on the committee. That's Senator Jason Lewis, who I believe is from Melrose. So you can find both of them on the legislature's website. So thank you again, once again, Ms. Oliver Davila, for raising that. So I want to just, reiterate briefly what my fellow committee members have stated. Thank you once again, not only for talking a little bit more about the 53 schools that have experienced increases in their budget since we began this process, but specifically outlining in some of the materials that you've distributed, Superintendent and members of the Office of Finance, the specific changes. And I want to focus in on, we heard about the Blackstone earlier. There's a number of other schools that have received soft landing funding allocations based on their declining enrollment. And remember, enrollment's down 1,200 kids this year in the city of Boston. That's a big decline for a district that serves just under 57,000 students now. And so that has real-time budget implications for us, especially in the way in which we receive money from the state. So, you know, trying, and again, this is to the credit of the finance office, trying to smooth out those impacts across a number of schools has been a challenge, and I think it's been admirable the way that you've been able to minimize to the extent possible those impacts on schools. I think it's been very important for our high schools as well as we've moved through the registration process with students affected by the closure of the West Roxbury Educational Complex, that we've been able to disperse funds from that reserve fund as well to each of those high schools to boost the funding that's going to each one of those schools. And as well, you know, I don't want to lose sight of the big investments that we've made in this budget overall. In addition to the changes that we've talked about recently, we've got more equity-based investments in getting kids into the exam schools. Excuse me, we've got more investments in school-based budgets, and all of this is with an eye towards returning as many dollars as possible to the classrooms to affect our students and to affect the experiences they are having in their classrooms and their learning. Mr. O'Neill, I believe you had one additional comment that you wanted to make. I want to take a moment to allow that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I apologize for violating protocol of forgetting it when I was speaking. But in light of this is the last time that Ms. Lawrence and her team is presenting, and with the number of folks here, I think it's important for people to hear that I met with some senior officials from the U.S. Department of Education on Monday. Some of the top folks advocating for BPS, and one of the senior advisors to the Secretary of Education specifically called out Ms. Lawrence and her team as one of the top CFOs and top budget teams of any school district in the country. So, and considering how important federal funding is for us for advocating for it, but also the amount of requirements that go into filing for grants, meeting the reporting requirements on it, alleviating risk for the district. All these things are important, not only getting the grants, but then actually following them through. And one of the top officials in the country in the education department specifically calls out our CFO and her team. That's worthy of making sure everyone in Boston knows that we have some really good people looking after our funds. So thank you, Ms. Lawrence, on behalf of your entire team.
Thank you again, Mr. O'Neill, for giving credit where it's due. Okay, if there are no further questions or discussion from the committee, I'm going to ask the Budget Office to return to their seats and Ms. Sullivan to call the general public comment.
Thank you, Mr. Lecanto. The public comment period is an opportunity for parents, students, and other concerned parties to make brief presentations to the school committee on pertinent school issues. Questions on specific school matters are not answered at this time, but are referred to the superintendent for a later response. Questions on specific policy matters are not answered at this time, but may be the subject of later discussion by the committee. Each speaker will have 3 minutes to speak, and I'll remind you when you have 1 minute remaining and then 30 seconds. Those who require interpretation services will receive an additional 2 minutes. Speakers may not reassign their time to others. Large groups addressing the same topic are encouraged to consolidate their remarks or choose a spokesperson to provide testimony. Written testimony is appreciated and encouraged. Any signage must not prohibit the participation of others. Please state your name and affiliation before you begin. TV cameras will only record speakers who face the committee. We have 15 speakers for this budget hearing, and we'll begin with our students, starting with Sylvie Hove, Caleb Thompson, and Shandera Soto. Is Sylvie and Caleb with us this evening? Come on up.
Well, while our students are approaching to testify, I just want to remind folks tonight that we're in a little bit different of a setup. We've had a delay in fixing the camera that's behind my head here that typically films the audience as well as the speakers at the podium. And so I believe the camera that's going to be focusing on the table for testimony tonight is the camera that is right next to the clock right on the rear wall there. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry, there's one above. And but I'd ask, as Ms. Sullivan mentioned earlier, to please direct your comments to us at the podium on the committee. So thank you and welcome.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Caleb Thompson, and I'm a student in the BTU school in the 6th grade. And I'm here with my fellow community members to talk about the budget cuts to our school. So if these budget cuts would follow through, we would lose 2 valued faculty members. Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
I'll be talking about what it means to lose one of these faculty staff, and Sylvie here will be talking about the other. So the one I will be referring to does essentially everything that is needed at any certain time. She can be a substitute teacher. I honestly can't count how many times we've lost the music teacher or the ELA teacher, and she's filled in, and she's done a good job at it. You know, unlike some other substitute teachers, she can actually control the class and teach the curriculum over us, which is, you know, very surprising. She coaches the debate team, who recently took 6 awards home from a debate tournament. And she also is the only teacher who goes to the tournaments on Saturdays. And in our first upper school dance, she paid out of her own pocket to make sure that it was an amazing experience for all of us. And she also runs the school talent show. So the talent show has been running for 3 years now, and it's allowed so many kids to share their special abilities. This year, even, the day I came back from my reduction procedure for my broken leg, she offered to do whatever it takes to actually get me to perform, to help me perform. She helps at recess and lunch, and, you know, when the class gets unruly, so she helps every day. And finally, she runs family outreach. So if there's a field trip going on, she'll make sure that every parent knows where it is, what it's going to, who's going. So losing her in general would mean a worse experience for all future students going to the BTU school. So I am requesting that you restore the BTU school's budget. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson.
Hi, I'm Sylvie. I am representing the Boston Teachers Union School Student Council. We will lose 2 members of our community due to the budget cuts if nothing is changed. I'll be speaking about how this will affect our school community. One of the members we will lose stays till 7 every day to help students get their grades up. She runs the Sunshine Fund, which sends teachers who are sick or lost a family member flowers. Our school is run by teachers and committees, and she runs the Instructional Leadership Committee. There would be fewer teachers for as many or more students in the 6th grade. Losing members of our school community would mean upper school has 4 teachers for around 5 classes. She is open to suggestions from other teachers. Every day she has to teach a class with students with all different learning styles. But she always does her best to help them continue to grow. Schedules would become a lot tighter, and students would have fewer chances to go to a teacher and ask a question. I do realize there are many departments, from fire to parks, that need money as well. But think about what you're taking away from the schools, what you're taking away from the students, and what you're taking away from the future. So we are asking you to restore our school's budget. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ms. Covey.
Our next speaker is Shandera Soto. She'll be followed by James Lines, Niven Williams, and Laura Lopez Fennett.
Good evening.
Good evening. Hello, my name is Shandira Soto, and I am from Boston Lion Academy. So I am a senior at Boston Academy, and I'm here to speak about my experience with guidance counselors. So our school has 6 guidance counselors for 1,800 students. That means that each guidance counselor gets about 300 students, which, as you can imagine, is a lot. So I, in my high school career, have had a lot of times where I was struggling and didn't really know who in the building I could go to. Because my guidance counselor is often very busy, I couldn't really go to her. Fortunately, I made connections with other adults in my building, but not all students have that privilege. So a lot of students might be struggling throughout the day and have nobody to go to, which, as you can imagine, will probably affect test scores and will not allow them to focus in class, which is what we want. We want students to learn and grow. And I know that my school is privileged because we have 6 guidance counselors. Some schools have none. So I'm here to ask you to make sure you prioritize guidance counselors when thinking about the budget, because they are really important and they have really affected the lives of many students. I have had the chance to talk to my guidance counselor a little bit more this year because, of course, she had to write my letter of recommendation for college. So I had no choice but to try and make some wiggle room and go and talk to her. But again, not all students have that chance. So yeah, that's all I would like to share.
Thank you, Ms. Soto.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is James Lyons. I'm a junior at Urban Science Academy. I'm with a group called Hyde Square Task Force, and we've created a campaign to bring more arts to our high schools. And we have surveyed 640 BPS students and have over 15 organizations in Boston supporting us right now. A few of us will give our short testimonies tonight, and here's mine. My grandparents would laugh as they would tell me how I would sing myself to sleep when I was 3, sometimes waking them up in the middle of the night. Just as art, like the art of music, once helped my 3-year-old self overcome his fear of the shadows, so does art now help me overcome the shadows in my mind. Through art, I am able to pick back up and continue on. As teenagers begin to discover their identities, their very place in the world often turns dark. Unforgiving realities consume us every day. Realities like working 3 jobs just to keep your family together, coming from another country, feeling lost and confused, an entirely new world, and college being only a couple steps away, along with a debt that you aren't able to pay. Our surveys of Boston high school students show that 86% of them feel that the arts reduces stresses in their lives, stresses just like I've listed right now. But only 20% of them feel that the arts are properly funded in their schools. This cannot go on any longer. Arts is in every part of our lives, whether we see it or not. There is song in our conversations and speeches, poetry in our essays, paint in our mathematical equations, dance in our sports, and acting in our job interviews. Art is the base of every one of our classes, and to teach without it is to learn without purpose. Though I acknowledge that our extra funding for implementing policy is limited due to the decreasing number of students, there are some high schools that don't even have half of an art class, while our elementary schools have several art opportunities both in and out of school. The shadows in my bedroom would have torn me apart if it wasn't for art. Please, support us in our fight for art education.
Thank you, Mr. Lyons.
Mr. Lyons, can you make sure we get a copy of your testimony? You can drop it off with Ms. Sullivan.
Yes.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Navia. I'm also with High Square Task Force, and I'd like to tell you that growing up with arts has always been a thing that kept me sane, happy, and mentally stable. I would always have moments in my life where I'd be depressed and needed a way to express myself. I couldn't exactly explain my feelings without doing it in a poetic manner or with illustrations. I couldn't exactly explain my feelings In a part of my life, I used to feel low and it would come up frequently. I wasn't doing my work, I was sleeping in class, I didn't talk to people, and I isolated myself from everybody. But an important fact is that through creativity and imagination, we find a reservoir and identity of healing. In class, it was the last period, and I drew a picture that was supposed to resemble beauty, love, and happiness, the things I felt I didn't have. But it was a picture that was supposed to resemble me, because even though I didn't feel it, it was there. Drawing that picture just brought peace to the madness in my head. Being able to create it and being able to see and understand it helped me cope with the things in my life. Today, I go through stress more than I ever knew. But whenever I step into the theater program at my job, I am able to let go of everything. Walking into an artistic place where you're able to participate is like stepping into a whole other carefree world where your problems are no longer a threat. Studies show that participating in music, arts, and can alleviate pain, help people manage stress, promote wellness, and so on. Personally, I can say that is true because after 2 hours of arts, I'm able to continue my day without thinking about the stressful things. And it lifts me up enough to allow me to do the things I have to do. Without arts, I would be struggling to find my peace of mind and struggling to fight my way through life too. I would not be as determined as I am now if I didn't have the space that allowed me to let go of all of the tension I carried within myself. And I think that's important to have in schools for children who struggle with work and struggle with their schoolwork and their time. So I believe that arts is a gateway to good for all people dealing with anxiety and stress, and I know it has been a gateway for me too.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Nivea, could we get a copy of your statement as well? Right to Ms. Sullivan, thank you.
Next, we'll hear from Laura Lopez Finnett, followed by Xavier Thomas and Ella Casino.
Good evening. My name is Laura Lopez Finnett. I'm a freshman vocalist at Boston Arts Academy, and I'm also a participant of ZoomX. Today I'll be singing a song by Will Daly, a local Boston artist, part of his song, and I'll also be sharing my opinion about the budget cuts. I learned to dance from a girl who could dance far better than I could even read. And I learned to fight from an old man who could fight, but me through the night would never having a swing. All that I wanted was all in my mind, and all that I need is to sing. All that I wanted was all in my mind, and all that I need is to sing. All that I wanted was all in my mind, and all that I need is to sing. All that I wanted was all in my mind, and all that I need is to sing. You can see all of the positive effects the arts have everywhere around you and in society in general. From mainstream arts, which we hear on the radio and see on TV, to expression in art everywhere in between. Plays, poetry, dance, spoken word, positive expression through the arts is everywhere we look, especially to those of us who choose arts as our career path. The arts teach us how to express ourselves and allows us to communicate with everyone through a deeper form of communication than just words. For me, I am lucky to have hours of art every day for school, but for my friends, they don't have the same opportunity. Many kids I know don't have no access to art in the way I do. Many public schools don't take art as seriously as academics. But for students and people, art might be the only thing that makes people feel safe, wanted, alive, or belonged.
20 seconds.
So I request you to increase the art budgets for Boston Public Schools. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ms. Thank you, Ms. Lopez Fine. If you have copies of your comments, we'd love to have those as well. I also want to let you know that I love Will dearly, but I can't hold a candle to you. So well done, and thank you for sharing that with us.
Thank you. Good evening. My name's Xavier. I'm a sophomore at BCLA. In 6th grade, I used to be bullied for being gay. I used to be teased for my style, my appearance, anything. They used to push me, drop my stuff, call me names. They fought with me and brought up my sexuality. School wasn't really the best place for me to express myself. I was constantly being picked on. I needed to find a place where I could let my worries flow away. I needed to find somewhere to be safe. In 8th grade, I joined a program called Hyde Square Task Force. I joined a teen theater group, and once I stepped in little by little, the stress fell off my shoulders. Once we started the theatrical activities, I started to see like this was finally a place where I belong, a place where I can finally be me. Theater training opened my eyes to reflect on my life and others. I saw that there were people who were afraid to be themselves and who were also not comfortable with themselves. We were able to support each other and grow together stronger. Because of my involvement in this theater program, now in school I express myself more and I have a confident personality. I am very well liked and people accept me for who I am, and I am now being looked up to. I'm glad to be a role model for others to show them that there's nothing wrong with being yourself and that I'm always here to help, to let people come out of their shell, to show that they can be the strong individuals I know they can be. I found an art program outside of my high school, but it would be great if we had opportunities like this inside our high school for students to have a chance to experience arts like I did. BPS has all great arts policies, but they have not yet been implemented, and now is the time to move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Xavier.
Hello, my name is Ella. I'm 16 and I go to Snowden International. There are some things that people can't live without, like food and water, shelter. Sometimes it's also friendship and love. Me, there is one thing specifically I don't think I can live without, and it is art. My favorite type of art is music. Without music, it would be hard to get in touch with my feelings. I used to struggle deeply with suicidal thoughts, anxiety, and depression, but using music made me who I am today. I first discovered my passion for music when I was 6 years old. Then I took singing lessons, took a little violin, some guitar, but I always went back to singing. Now I'm in high school, and I realized that there are no arts for musicians and singers. I had to keep at it since there was no music class. I love my music because it helped me through hard times. Like when I didn't have enough money for the bus, I had to walk home in the pouring rain. I came up with a song called Cents in My Pocket. Arts helps me remember the good times I had. Art is my life. I couldn't live without it. And I know others can relate to me because I know kids are being less exposed to arts in BPS high schools, and that is not right. Teens need art. We carry too much weight on our shoulders. We have places to go and things to get done while we do our homework, manage relationships, manage our academics. For me, art takes the weight off my shoulders and puts it into the world in a beautiful way. Others feel this way too, because at Hyde Square Task Force, we handed out a survey to high school students, and it turns out 90% of students believe that arts add value to their lives, and 86% of students report that the art helps them reduce stress in their lives. I felt like I was the only one who felt that way, but I'm not. I'm not. We need to make arts more accessible in BPS because there are a lot of people who can't afford to take art lessons, and art is a graduation requirement for all BPS students, and colleges pay more attention to people that take part in art because it's an important skill and trait to have. Art helps me be less stressed out, and I couldn't live without it. Can you live without art?
Thank you, Ella.
Thank you. Ella, can we get a copy of your statement as well to Ms. Sullivan? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Dan Goldsberry, and he'll be followed, thank you, by Paul Shove-Kozak and Joel Thompson.
Well, Mr. Goldberry is approaching. I want to say thank you to the Hyde Square Task Force and all the folks that came out tonight to testify as well as to support those that were testifying. I think there's a number of people in the audience wearing purple this evening that are in support of the arts and BPS. We've had a number of... We've had a lovely performance this evening, as well as a number of very compelling pieces of testimony, and so we greatly appreciate your sharing your thoughts with us, as well as working with the district on the implementation of the arts policy going forward. I noticed a number of you are holding up signs that have a hashtag on it. It looks like Boss Teen Arts, BOS Teen Arts. So if folks want to learn a little bit more about what this campaign is online, please go forward and seek out that hashtag. Thank you, Mr. Goldsberry.
Good evening. My name is Dan Goldsberry. I'm a school counselor at Up Academy Boston. Homelessness, trauma, finding and applying to high schools and colleges, family challenges, peer mediation, attendance issues, challenges with teachers. Each of the students I work with as a licensed Boston Public School counselor has their own unique needs and challenges, and often they experience them, many at one time. In my role, I support 165 eighth graders, each with unique and pressing needs, so my time with each of them is precious. Imagine my BPS colleague who has 938 students to support. Though I cannot speak to her full experience, I do know she spends much of her time responding to crises. While responding to crisis situations is an important part of a school counselor's job, it leaves little time for such interventions as proactive planning, outreach to service providers, collaboration with teachers and families, and supporting students not in crisis. In BPS, we currently have 107 school counselors based on a contractually mandated ratio of 1 counselor for every 300 students in high school and 1 for every 400 students in middle school. However, these figures represent a citywide average and therefore do not apply to every school. Additionally, these 107 school counselors are not equitably staffed in our highest need schools. There are some BPS schools that have as many as 8 licensed school counselors to support their student body, which I think is great. However, there are many which have no licensed school counselors at all. For example, there are dozens of schools currently serving students in grades K through 8, which are not subject to any of the contract provisions for student to counselor ratios. Social emotional support, as one of the district's stated priorities, should be given the same equitable staffing we give to staffing core content areas. The next teacher's contract represents a golden opportunity to address the inequitable distribution of support services for students in Boston. Thousands of our young people will go to school tomorrow in a building without a licensed school counselor. Let's prove to them that social emotional support is not just a buzzword, but a priority in the Boston Public Schools. Thank you.
Good evening.
Good evening. Buenas tardes a todos y todas. My name is Paul Shove-Kozak. I am a co-chair of the school parent counselor at the Mario Mon Academy, East Boston. And I'm here, thank you, shout out. And I'm here to testify to a concern that we have regarding inequity and a lack of transparency in funding dual language programs. In the budget documents made public on the BPS website, 2 language schools, the Hernandez K through 8, Hurley K through 8, are each receiving $100,000 in supplemental allocation specifically to support dual language. This supplemental funding was granted to the 2 schools in FY 2019 and 18 as well, which was as far back as we could see on the BPS website. This clearly shows BPS's recognition of the need for long-term sustained support for dual language programs and a strong commitment to the success of dual language programs. We must ask then, why are other dual language schools in BPS, Mario Mana, Meadowhaunt, Greenwood, Munez Academy, not receiving the same support? Our principal shared these concerns with the budget office, at least we were told so, in February, shortly after the budget information was made public, and we noticed the discrepancy. We were told that there would be a meeting with us to explain why the discrepancy. A month later, we have not heard from anyone. We're still waiting for a meeting or any form of communication. Our school is not fully dual language yet. However, due to the size of our school, 953 students, next year's dual language population in grades K through 1 will surpass both the Hurley and the Hernandez. We currently have over 400 students in K1 through grades 8. So we're asking immediate intervention in this budget issue, and that we receive the supplemental allocation like the other schools. And like I mentioned, it's a concern as far as school equity goes. Thank you. In our letter, we have the footnotes where we note where we actually found the discrepancies. Thank you very much.
Great.
And sorry, I also want to thank some teachers from the Yomana who are here: Joss Hardister, Hagar Sherman, Bridget Rogan, and Mr. Armando Jaime.
Great.
Thank you.
And Mr. Shof-Kozak? Mr. Shof-Kozak, if you can drop off your testimony as well, and Eleanor Lawrence can speak with you in the back. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we'll hear from Joel Thompson and Kristen Johnson. After Ms. Johnson, we'll hear from Paul Friedman and Lauren Peter.
Good evening.
Good evening. My name is Kristen Johnson, and I'm here tonight on behalf of a newly formed coalition called the Boston Coalition for Education Equity. Our membership includes the Boston branch of the NAACP, Lawyers for Civil Rights, Quest, Beja, Boston Network for Black Student Achievement, Citizens for Public Schools, Downtown Progressives, JP Progressives, Progressives West Roxbury and Roslindale, Healthy Food for Boston, School Action Network, Surge, and more organizations joining us every day. We share a unified goal of dismantling systemic educational inequity in Boston. We have spent the past week listening to families dream bigger for their children by asking your stakeholders this simple question: what are the elements of a quality education? The responses we've received so far, which you were all just given a copy of, have been overwhelming, with more than 40 contributions online and dozens in person at a forum last night. Diverse voices from all over the city are singing the same refrain: our children deserve so much more. Our survey respondents did not ask for STEM labs or international field trips or tablets or other expensive technology. Their requests were incredibly modest: nurses, libraries with librarians, reading and math specialists, inclusion support, art and music, safe outdoor spaces, clean restrooms, healthy food, family engagement, counselors of all varieties, a school secretary, bus monitors. Why do our families need to ask for basic educational components that are available to nearly every suburban district that borders this city? We demand a solution and an answer to this question: what is going wrong? Has weighted student funding delivered on its promise of providing equity, or has it built the educational future of 56,000 children on a foundation made of quicksand? We call on you to change the way you build school budgets. Begin by deciding on the components of the quality education that BPS will provide for every student. Give each student the funds it needs to provide that education. Then include extra money for children who face extra challenges, the justification for weighted student funding. But guarantee that every student receive the core components of a quality education. We understand the financial constraints due to the declining state aid to BPS and encourage everyone in this room to join us at the State House on Friday to support the Promise Act. But even if we increase revenue to BPS, the instability and volatility will persist if we don't first define our priorities and then align the structure of the budget with these priorities. We must act now because Boston's children cannot continue to wait for a moment when it's politically convenient to address this prime driver of equity crisis in our schools.
Thank you, Ms.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson.
Good evening. My name is Paul Friedman. I'm the co-chair of the School Site Council at the Sumner Elementary School in Roslindale. Under the proposed budget, the Sumner is facing a budget cut of about $255,000 next year. The Sumner will be forced to cut staff that directly support the school's goal of making the Sumner the best learning environment it can be for our children if the money is not restored to the school's budget. Because of our high number of English language learners, we are mandated to hire another full-time English as a second language teacher. This is an important hire for equity and learning purposes and will benefit the nearly 50% of our students who are English learners. This mandated $100,000 expenditure needs to be made up elsewhere in our budget. For the past 5 years, our school has been budgeted for about 590 students. In most years, there have been closer to 560 students for some of the reasons that were mentioned earlier about allocation of students. BPS is projecting will be closer to that level of enrollment moving forward. This change accounts to about $155,000 of reduced funding. Unfortunately, these 30 empty seats are spread across many classrooms, grades, and strands. The Sumner has sheltered English instruction. It has substantially separate special ed. It has inclusion strands, and it has general ed strands. So there are many classrooms at every grade level, and there are empty pockets throughout all of those classes, but only a couple of seats in each room. Therefore, we cannot reduce the number of homerooms that are being funded or teachers being funded at the school. As a result, we're sort of working around the edges. The positions we were forced to cut were put in place for an important reason, to ensure that teachers have the support to focus on the most effective teaching possible and to make sure students don't fall through the gaps. Even with these supports, only 3 or 4 out of every 10 Sumner students are able to achieve mastery on the MCAS. Students who are English language learners, have a disability, and/or experience other disadvantages due to racism or economic insecurity may require additional support to achieve at grade level. Cuts will disproportionately impact these students. Cutting these positions will hinder Principal Welsh, who is our new principal, and the teachers as they help all students learn in one of the largest elementary schools in the city. We believe it is not okay to shortchange a school that is underperforming already and is one of the largest elementary schools in Boston. This is especially true for a school that has been invigorated by new leadership and is looking to make substantial changes to its performance. While we are adding support for English learners, we are having to remove supports for other struggling groups, including students with disabilities. This is like robbing Peter to pay Paul. It is not fair to force the school to make these choices. We really strongly encourage you to please restore our funding. I also want to address Mr. O'Neill's comment about waitlist. As a person who's been through the beginning of the school year with my own children at the Sumner a number of times, at the beginning of the year, what we see students leave or not show up for school on the first days of school, and it takes a while to fill those seats. Since we only start around September 15th, it's about 1 month before we take the formal count. That seems ridiculous, especially considering the state system for funding schools. When students move around the state, get checked in 3 or 4 times a year, I believe. I think it's called SIMS. It seems like that should be able to help us do that. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Friedman. Our next speaker is Lauren Peter, and she'll be followed by Patricia Slevin.
Hi, my name is Lauren Peter, and my daughter Vivian is a K1 student at Sumner. I'm going to try not to repeat everything that Paul just said. I'm at this meeting speaking on my daughter's behalf, but more importantly on the behalf of all the students at the school. We're a very large school, and we serve a very high needs population. Our new principal has been working really hard this year, getting to know her staff, the parents, the students, and finding ways to close our educational gaps. Now she's going to have to do that with over $200,000 less in her budget. We will lose reading support when 60 to 70% of our students are not meeting expectation. We will lose instructional coaches for our inclusion teachers and an instructional coach that supports teachers to better meet our students' academic needs. Our library paraprofessional will only be there for 4 days of the week. On a more personal note for me, we will only have 1 paraprofessional for our K2 general education classrooms. That means my daughter is going to have a ratio of 25 students to 1 adult, 1 teacher for much of her day. She's 5 years old. That seems ridiculous. I also have a question for you. To that note, I know that my daughter's classroom was down 5 students in October. I know that they were down 5 students in October, and I know her classroom is full right now. So I'm asking you right now, how are you certain that you are meeting the funding that her school needs? How can you say that to us? So I'm asking you to please readdress the funding for our school, because we're trying very hard. The parents are raising as much money as we can, but we can't raise $255,000.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Peter.
Hi, I'm a parent, and basically talking about City Connects at the Winship School. And this is my statement. Hi, my name is Patricia Shevlin. I'm a single parent to my daughter, my 6-year-old daughter. That's a first grader at the Winship Elementary School. She has some special needs that wasn't nearly addressed from the previous school that she had attended. Ms. White has been incredibly supportive from the beginning. She has helped me advocate services for my daughter. I truly admire her ability to bond, connect, and the passion that she has for the Winship community. Her role is not only essential, but ever so valuable and a necessity to the school. That is why the City Connects program shouldn't be cut or ended from the school budget. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Seven.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Jessica Tang.
Good evening, Ms. Tang. Thank you for bringing along Vice President Berg, and I see former President Stepman is in the audience as well, so welcome. I believe, I apologize, City Councilor Nissa Sabi George joined us earlier. Yes, in the crowd, our at-large City Councilor and the Chair of the Council's Committee on Education. Welcome, Ms. Tang.
Thank you. Good evening. My name is Jessica Tang, and I am proud to serve as the president of the Boston Teachers Union, here with our vice president as well. Tonight, my statement is brief. We just left a very energetic rally with educators, parents, students, paraprofessionals, ABA, school psychologists, guidance counselors, social workers, and other community allies. And we are here today because we believe in a contract that our students deserve. We believe in the priorities that we're fighting for, including school nurses, special education, inclusion done right, social workers, school psychologists, wraparound supports, and supporting homeless students. And we are proud to stand in solidarity, and our message is very brief, which is that we're ready to get this done because our students deserve it, and we don't want to waste another day. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Tang.
Mr. Lecanto, that concludes our speakers for this budget hearing.
Well, thank you, Ms. Sullivan. First of all, I want to thank everyone once again for coming out this evening and sharing your testimony on the budget and how that affects individual schools as well as the district at large. I want to thank once more the Hyde Square Task Force for coming out in particular force. I'm sorry. And I just want to remind everyone that, as we move through the budget, we do have a final recommendation before us this evening. We'll take a vote at the meeting next week, but we still want to hear from you. And so if there are further comments that you have, you can always reach us through budget@bostonpublicschools.org, an email. You can also send your messages directly to members on the school committee. And you can access any documents regarding the budget online at www.bostonpublicschools.org/budget. So I'll now entertain a motion from the committee to adjourn tonight's budget hearing and move into the regularly scheduled school committee meeting.
So moved.
Thank you, Dr. Coleman. Is there a second? Thank you, Ms. Robinson. Is there any discussion or objection to that motion?
Mr. Chair, just as we adjourn, may I strictly thank the members of the BTU and their other friends who were outside today. I know a number of the school committee members, including myself, were outside reading the signs, talking with a few folks, learning. We're a fun city here, right, particularly when we're trying to get a contract done. But we have incredible professionals in all of our schools, and I know we recognize that. And we thank people for showing up today and sharing their comments and their thoughts.
Thank you, Mr. O'Neill. Ms. Sullivan, will you please call the roll?
Dr. Coleman?
Yes.
Mr. O'Neill?
Yes.
Dr. Rivera?
Yes.
Ms. Robinson?
Yes.
Mr. Tran?
Yes.
Ms. Oliver Davila?
Yes.
Mr. Lecanto?
Yes.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ms. Sullivan. We'll now move on right into tonight's regularly scheduled school committee meeting. I'd like to begin with the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. So as folks are filing out of the meeting room, we'll begin with the approval of minutes from the February 27th, 2019 meeting as presented. If the minutes are approved as presented, hard copies will be made available immediately in the hallway with the other handouts. If changes are made, you can access the minutes tomorrow on the BPS website. Excuse me. At this time, I'd like to entertain a motion to approve the minutes from the February 27th, 2019 meeting as presented. Thank you, Mr. O'Neill. Looks like a second from Ms. Robinson. Is there any discussion or objection to the motion? Hearing none, the minutes are approved. We'll move on now to Interim Superintendent's report. I present to you our Interim Superintendent, Ms. Laura Perot.
Thank you, Chair Lecanto. Since it looks like we have a changing of the guard in the constellation of the room, I will begin by recapturing some of my earlier statements. Thank you all again for being here this evening, for coming out tonight and being a part of these ongoing conversations. We also appreciate the voices of our union teachers and partners from the Boston Teachers Union in this important and ongoing dialogue. A few moments ago, we held a hearing with the school committee where we shared that through this budget process over the past month and a half, we have been able to add back in roughly $3.2 million to the budgets of 53 schools for FY20, building on our budget proposal from last month. The other change that was noted is the addition based on the recent announcement by Mayor Walsh in the City of Boston that we will have funding to provide free M7 MBTA passes to students in grades 7 to 12 for the coming school year. This is an investment that students, families, and staff have been asking about for years. We are thrilled to be able to make this possible heading into the next school year. As always, we want to thank both the BPS Budget Office, but also our partners in the City Finance Department for working so carefully to build the support that we need and provide the resources we need. We particularly recognize that the city has been stepping up to the plate to make additional investments for our students, making up for what the state aid has lagged behind. And as many of you know, the budget process is truly a process and an ongoing public dialogue that involves input from students, parents, teachers, staff members, and community members, as you saw in the earlier packed room this evening. So we are grateful for that support around our shared desire to see the students of the Boston Public Schools be successful by providing the best possible use of our resources on behalf of our students. Since we did have a little bit of a celebration going on outside on the way in, we want to again thank our teachers, as Mr. O'Neill was saying, but also our union partners for the ongoing dialogue. In regard to ongoing contract negotiations, the BPS is actively engaged in the collective bargaining process with the Boston Teachers Union, our largest labor partner. We remain committed to engaging in a constructive dialogue with our labor partners. In order to ensure the continuation of productive conversations, the district will refrain from commenting on specific issues that are being discussed at the bargaining table, but finalizing an agreement that puts student interests first and is fiscally sustainable for all of our school communities is an important priority to which the Boston Public Schools is fully committed. Reviewing and expanding a range of social emotional supports for our students continues to be an ongoing priority for the district. This includes counseling as well as health and wellness services. This past year, BPS was able to add 10 nurses to its staffing level and secured at least a half-time nurse at every school, and in many schools more than that. Additionally, this month, we announced the formation of 6 working groups, including one focused specifically on enhancing school guidance counseling supports. So we are committed to this ongoing work as well. I do want to move on to some highlights around the district. We'll start with some thrilling news for a number of our students from Tech Boston Academy in the world of high school sports. I want to give a huge shout out to the Tech Boston Academy Bears, which actually is constituted of students from both the Henderson Inclusion as well as Tech Boston Academy. They won, as the defending champions, they won the Division II state championship for the 2nd year in a row. They beat Taconic High School 69-54 in a riveting game. There were lots of Boston fans out in Worcester, myself included. There were 4 Tech Boston players who scored in double figures with just a remarkable display of team play. I also want to offer special thanks to head coach Johnny Williams as well as the entire coaching staff. And I want to paraphrase a quote from Coach Williams that appeared in the Boston Globe, but it is worth repeating. He said about the win, "This means everything for our kids. It means everything to the city of Boston. It's not just for us. It is for every kid that comes up in an urban environment. We make it so that they can look at our guys and they can believe. Now these kids in the city can definitely look up to our guys." So kudos to that. We heard a lot this evening about the power of arts and the desire of many of our older students for continued expansion of arts education in the Boston Public Schools. BPS has been on a path of fairly dramatic expansion of arts education during the school day over the last 10 years. We clearly have more work to do, particularly at the high school level. So we are pleased with the advocacy of our young people as we continue to step forward around expanded arts learning opportunities. But meanwhile, with the significant expansion that has happened at our K-8 grades, where roughly 96% of our students now experience at least weekly arts education, if not more, we were able to witness several different examples of that. One was the Haley School Hip Hopera. I'm not mispronouncing that. A great example of using the arts to tie in history and cultural identity lessons took place over the last few weeks at the Haley School in Roslindale, where students performed combining hip-hop and opera into their hip hopera. And while the performances happened this month, the school used the opportunity to continue the lessons of Black History Month from February to demonstrate that diversity and heritage should be celebrated year-long. So I want to thank theater director Jason Wise and music director Dan Dehart for using art to bring these important lessons to life. I also enjoyed stopping by the Roosevelt School's production of The Lion King Jr. at Riverside Theater last weekend. In addition to the amazing performances by our students, I really have to tip my hat to the staff, students, and families who created the most amazing costumes and sets that I have seen recently. It was just a remarkable evening, and I want to thank the terrific staff at the Roosevelt and everyone, including the families, who put together the wonderful performance by their students. And that concludes my report.
Well, thank you, Interim Superintendent Perillo. Before I move on to members for questions and comments, I just want to take an additional moment to note a trip that Mr. O'Neill and I took along with a number of other representatives of the district and the city down to Washington, D.C. over the weekend and in the first part of this week. It's the Council of Great City Schools Legislative Conference, annual Legislative and Policy Conference, and it was a great success this year. We were joined by the city's Federal Relations Director, Virginia Mayor, as well as Anu Jainath from our budget office here at the district, up on Capitol Hill on Monday to speak with our representatives and senators in Congress, and we spoke with they were out of session, but we were able to speak with our the staff in Representatives Presley and Lynch's office, as well as Senators Markey and Warren, about the president's proposed budget this year, which shorts education by $8.5 billion. And through some of the crack staff here in the budget, we've come up with preliminary estimates that translates to about a $10 million shortfall for BPS in federal funds. That's at Title I, Title II, Title IV, and IDEAA funding. And so, the good news for Massachusetts and for Boston in particular is that our representatives in Congress remain steadfast behind us in seeking to close that gap and restore funding for education. Our representatives are in lockstep with us on a number of the issues that we raised, and in particular Title II funding. The Title II funds, which would be zeroed out in the president's budget, the way that we use those funds, it's about $3.9 million a year, is for supporting expansion in teacher diversity within our ranks, as well as professional development for our teachers. And those are two key initiatives of our district. And so losing that money would be a big blow to the efforts that we've worked so hard for around the district. So I want to thank all of those who were out there advocating with us. We heard from Representative Dwight Evans, not that Dwight Evans, gentleman from the state of Pennsylvania, who is the head of one of the subcommittees on the Hill dealing specifically with transportation and infrastructure. Our own Representative Lynch is a member of that subcommittee, and we learned on this trip that there will be a hearing specifically on school buildings as part of any infrastructure efforts that will happen in Congress in the upcoming session. And Representative Evans spent a great deal of his time with us talking about how he wants to support any infrastructure bill funding investments in school buildings, and Representative Lynch's office has given us assurances that he will make every effort to support that work here in Boston. So, Mr. O'Neill, I'll first turn to you and ask you if there's anything else that you'd like to add from the work here, and then we can, of course, move into questions and comments from members.
No, it was great to spend time, in particular, with Congresswoman Presley's office. Obviously, she had been a fantastic partner with us when she was a city councilor, knows our schools extraordinarily well, and her chief of staff was extremely supportive, as were the folks from Senator Markey's and Warren's office. So we also had a chance to talk about, as the chair said, including school buildings in an infrastructure bill, finding a fix for the DACA issue, school safety, and that it should be more preventative, and particularly we talked about behavioral psychologists, guidance counselors, social workers, and nurses, and the needs to get more federal funding for that. And then we also reiterated a strong opposition to any type of voucher program. And so those were the key messages we were delivering, and they were extraordinarily well received by all of the offices. We also dove into telecommunications issues, improving broadband access for our schools. Senator Markey's team has spent a lot of time on that, and they were, quite frankly, surprised to learn that we still have broadband issues in our schools, and asked for more details on that. Overall, it's a successful visit. I will also mention that as part of a small delegation from the Council of Great City Schools, the officers, of which I am one, we did also meet with Secretary DeVos in a small group in her office. And that conversation was mainly around the implementation of ESSA, the Every Student Succeed Acts, and how it's going on a state-by-state basis. I did share that, in fact, we have worked well with DESE on it, on the schools that have been identified as needing additional support, and particularly that we had identified with them the 10 schools that have to write turnaround plans. I also shared the concern that, in fact, we're only getting funding from the state for one of those, roughly $900,000 per year for 3 years, and that we had identified the Ellis. Secretary DeVos wanted to know how we chose the Ellis. That was her one question, at least to myself. And so we stepped through how we did that. I'm not quite sure she heard the message that we actually wanted funding for the others. But she was gracious and listened. We respectfully disagree with her with many of the viewpoints she and her office have expressed. She did indicate a willingness to have the Department of Education work on any waivers that districts request, and that was an important message for us. And lastly, I in particular asked her what message she wanted us to deliver back to our school boards, as we represented, the Council Grade City Schools represent 75 cities and 7.8 million school children across the country, and the particular needs of the urban school districts and boards, and what message did she want delivered back. And her message was, she said that she supports our work, but asked us to think creatively and boldly on new solutions to problems that have traditionally stymied school boards. And if there, in her words, if there was anything the Department of Education could do to help us when we think of creating new solutions, she was willing to listen and see what they could do. I pass along that message as it was said by her.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. O'Neill. I want to open it up now to members for questions or discussion. Well, hearing none, thank you. If there's no further discussion, I'll entertain a motion to accept and receive the interim superintendent's report as presented. Thank you, Ms. Oliver Davila. Sounded like a second from Ms. Robinson. Any discussion or objection to that motion? Any objection to approving the interim superintendent's report by unanimous consent? Hearing none, the report is approved. And now, before we move on to general public comment, I'd like to invite our student representative, Ms. Evelyn Reyes, to give her monthly Boston Student Advisory Council report. Ms. Reyes, thank you.
Of course. Good evening, everyone. All right, so it's been a while, and I will start with an event that we had last month. BSAC hosted a town hall on the Promise Act last month in February, and we had over 100 young people in attendance. It was in this very room. And students discussed the necessity of such legislation and our views on hopefully a fully funded future. We're happy to share that we've had these conversations with youth from the following organizations: Youth Justice Power Union, Sociedad Latina, the City School, Mascosh, I Have a Future, the Mayor's Youth Council, Teen Empowerment, Hyde Square Task Force, Inquilinos Boricuas en Acción, and the Boston Chinatown Neighborhood Center. As a follow-up to this discourse, BSAC students will be testifying at the hearing later this week, and we would like to echo the comments of some other members, and that we encourage community members to attend that hearing if possible, and certainly to spread the word about the Promise Act. More recently, last Friday, BSAC students participated in the Global Climate Change Strike. Members of our Environmental Justice and Sustainability Subcommittee shared powerful words at the rally and later attended the town hall to listen to legislators, and they were also strong in their efforts to have legislators sign the No Fossil Fuel Money pledge. Within the last week, students have also been meeting with city councilors to discuss our priorities, as well as signing the same No Fossil Fuel Money pledge, as well as a pledge to support the student vote movement. Councilors Edwards, Garrison, and Flynn have signed on to the student vote pledge specifically, and we look forward to meeting with more city councilors soon. In the same vein, later this week, we are sending students to the State House for our spring series of legislative drops. At the legislative drops, we will again be asking for lawmakers to sign both of those pledges. And lastly, in terms of outreach, the BSAC staff have sent out an election toolkit to help schools elect their school officials, or their student officials, before the end of this year. And we are following up with phone calls to schools and prioritizing those schools that have been historically underrepresented in BSAC. And we're also facilitating trainings around the district to increase student interest in BSAC, and those trainings have mostly been about our Student Rights app and also just a general overview of what we do as BSAC. Thank you.
Well, that's excellent. Thank you very much, Ms. Reyes, and thank you again for mentioning the number of schools that aren't currently represented. And again, you know, if there's any calls that the committee can make to help facilitate gaining representation in those schools, we're happy to do so. I want to open it up now to members for any question or discussion for Ms. Reyes.
Great job.
Ms. Robinson.
One question. What has the student response been to the announcement around the M7 passes?
We've been very excited about that, and because it opens up so many more possibilities for every student. And I actually am glad you brought that up, because I'd also like to, I mean, they're not here anymore, but shout out High Square Task Force for a lot of the work that they've done around promoting the necessity of M7s, and as well as a ton of other youth groups who have worked with us and separate from us, but still for the same thing, because it's really been a group effort.
It's taken, what, almost 5 years since this conversation began to actually have it come to fruition, so some of the current students weren't even in high school. And I'm just wondering if they've had any chance to reflect upon how long it may take for a good idea to actually get the full funding that it well deserves, and the importance of sticking to it through many different iterations of students to come to this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's reflected in a lot of the work that we do, just because it's on my mind a lot. But the student vote campaign has also been going on for many years, almost a decade. So
great. Right, thank you.
And if I can just add, thank you, that with regard to the M7 announcement, I would say that received an overwhelmingly positive response from staff, from teachers. There were tweets, there were emails. We don't usually get that much of an enthusiastic response when a central office email goes out, but let me just tell you that on the day of the announcement of M7s, and we heard from K-8 school leaders who were thrilled for their 7th and 8th graders, for high school students, and just everyone broadly understands that this not only facilitates full school choice for our students, but also facilitates their exploration in out-of-school time, both evenings and weekends. So we are delighted on behalf of the city and the Boston Public Schools to finally get to that milestone for our students.
Thank you, Ms. Robinson. Mr. O'Neill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Robinson, you bring up a great point. So, Ms. Reyes, I hope you and your fellow leaders at BSEC actually reach out to your predecessors as student representatives who have been fighting the fight on this for a number of years and have thoughtfully and articulately advocated on this. And I think of two in particular that really this was a distinct passion of theirs. Mr. Ulamuyua, who was a student rep for 2 years, and then Mr. McClay as well. And several of the other predecessors in there worked on it as well. But I hope BSAC reaches back out to them to let them know they rightfully deserve a lot of credit for that. And yourself as well. Obviously, you've been quite forceful on it as well. So we thank you.
Thank you, Mr. O'Neill. There are other questions or comments? Well, hearing none, thank you once again, Ms. Reyes, for giving us a monthly report. We look forward to next month. We'll move on now to general public comment. Ms. Sullivan.
Thank you, Mr. Locanto. We have 3 speakers for this portion, and again, each speaker will have 3 minutes. We'll begin with Boston City Councilor Anissa Asabi George, and she'll be followed by Ramilda Pereira and Alexis Smith.
Does this work all the way over here? A weird spot. Good evening, Interim Superintendent Perrell, Chairman Locanto, and members of the school committee. My name is Anissa Asabi George. I'm a Boston City Councilor at Large and Chair of the Committee on Education. As the City Council prepares to receive the budget this April, and the school committee will be preparing to take its vote next week, I'd like to take this opportunity to state that I will be supporting and paying close attention to the schools that are losing funding, programs, and staff. As a matter of fact, today I sat with the Chair of Ways and Means to ensure that we have budget hearings that includes a focus on schools with declining budgets. I will also be strongly continuing to advocate for full-time nurses and social-emotional professionals in all of our schools. Additional support in the Office of Special Education to ensure that IEPs are being met, school safety and security measures, students experiencing homelessness, vocational education, as well as employment opportunity for our youth. I would like to mention that it is great that we now have at least a 0.5 nurse at all of our school buildings across the district. But I would like to also note that some schools had just over a 0.5 nurse, and part of that recalibration last year meant a decline in a few of our schools. I'd like to also take this opportunity to congratulate Madison Park Technical Vocational High School for receiving reaccreditation from NEASC. NEASC made recommendations that I hope to address through a scheduled hearing on April 9th at 3 p.m. at City Hall regarding adequate funding for our city's only vocational and technical high school, Madison Park, and the implementation of an admissions policy. I'm also happy to share that in partnership with the Humane Society of Massachusetts, we have successfully applied for and have been awarded a grant for CPR training in some of our schools. This will be piloted at East Boston High School and Charlestown High School, where we will have the funds available to train 4 teachers and 400 kids over the next school year. You'll hear a little bit more about this grant later in your agenda. I appreciate the opportunity to see you. And I'd also like to add to Ms. Reyes, I have already signed the fossil fuel pledge. So when I met with your students, they didn't need to ask me to sign on because I already was. So I just would like to make note of that for the record. But I thank you and your fellow students and activists for their work on everything that they do. I thank you all.
Thank you, Counselor.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Ramilda Pereira. Is Ms. Pereira with us? Alexis Smith? No? Ms. Smith?
Okay.
Okay. Mr. Laconda, that concludes our speakers for general public comment.
Well, thank you, Ms. Sullivan. Our first action item this evening is a consent calendar, which consists of grants for approval totaling $843,382 and 5 international travel requests. I'd like to turn it over to the interim superintendent for any final comments.
We have no additional comments, although we are always thrilled to see the schools and partners that organize field trips. This is field trip time of the year, heading into April spring vacation, which is the reason for the large number. And then, as always, the central office works incredibly hard, as do a number of schools, to secure the outside grants, which you'll be reviewing as well.
Well, thank you, Ms. Perill, and I want to note that East Boston High School Headmaster Phil Rangia-Ford has joined us this evening. Hello, Headmaster. It's always nice to see our school leaders in the audience. I know you're here for one of our grants this evening. I wanted to open up now to members for questions or discussion on the grants and travel requests that are before us. Ms. Robinson.
Okay. I have a question about 2 grants. One, the school nutrition equipment assistance grant. Are those dollars or those programs going into schools that do not have My Way Cafe or schools that do, or how does this work?
Thank you.
Yeah.
She's going to answer this for us. And please introduce yourself.
Sure. My name is Deborah Ventureselli. I'm Deputy Director of Food and Nutrition. Those schools were chosen as possible schools that will be converted to My Way Cafe, so they're currently satellite schools. And we decided to, that's standard equipment. Those are 2 tables, hot and a cold serving area, to add those to each of the schools to help in the funding of those transformations.
Great, that's what I thought, yeah. The second question is about the students displaced by Hurricane Maria and Irma, and it says that all of the money for that grant goes to staffing. Is that new staffing, or does it support existing staff?
And Anu Jayanth will come up to answer that question for us.
Good evening.
Good evening. This money is actually, we were allocated another $265,000 last year, so this is an additional allocation, and it goes to offset any costs associated with those students. So we're using it for, primarily for just the benefit costs for teachers that were in those schools.
Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you, Ms. Robinson. Are there any other questions or discussion for the consent calendar that's before us? Well, hearing none, I'd entertain a motion to approve the consent calendar as presented.
So moved.
Thank you, Mr. O'Neill. Is there a second? Ms. Robinson? Any discussion or objection to that motion? Any objection to approving the consent calendar by unanimous consent? Hearing none, the consent calendar is approved. Our next action item this evening is the nomination of Dr. Lorna Rivera as the co-chair of the committee's English Language Learners Task Force. You will recall that at our last meeting, I presented for the committee's consideration the nomination of Dr. Rivera. Dr. Rivera is going to fill the leadership role formerly held by Dr. Uriarte, our colleague who stepped down from the committee late last year. Dr. Rivera, for folks that haven't heard, is the director of the Mauricio Gaston Institute for Latino Community Development and Public Policy at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, where she is also an associate professor of women's and gender studies. She is also a Boston Public Schools parent, and I'm confident that Dr. Rivera will, and her extensive background in student advancement, will bring an urgent voice and leadership to this task force. Dr. Rivera, pardon me, if you'd like to say anything further, I'd be happy to give you the floor, and then we can open it up for further comments or questions from the committee.
It would be a great honor to serve on this task force, so thank you for considering me. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Dr. Rivera. And yes, thank you for giving us yet more of your time. This only started as a one-year commitment, but little did you know. Are there other further comments or questions from fellow members? Mr. O'Neill.
May I just strictly say two things. One, thank you for your willingness to serve. And I think you will find, as you spend more time on this committee, the seriousness in which we take the recommendations and the thoughts of the ELL Task Force, of the Opportunity and Achievement Gap Task Force, the Inclusion Task Force, the Internal Audit Task Force, which is about to report. So the work they do is critical, and it really guides our work very much. So thank you for your willingness to serve, and thank your fellow task force members.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. O'Neill, and thank you once again, Dr. Rivera. If there are no further questions, I'll entertain a motion to approve the nomination of Dr. Lorna Rivera to serve as co-chair of the English Language Learners Task Force as presented.
So moved.
Thank you, Dr. Coleman. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Mr. Tron. Is there any discussion or objections to the motion? Ms. Sullivan, will you please call the roll?
Dr. Coleman?
Yes.
Mr. O'Neill?
Yes.
Dr. Rivera?
Yes.
Ms. Robinson?
No. No.
Excuse me, Ms. Robinson?
Yes.
Mr. Tran?
Yes.
Ms. Oliver Davila?
Yes.
Mr. Lecanto?
Yes.
The motion passes unanimously.
Well, thank you, Ms. Sullivan. Thank you once again, Dr. Rivera. I really enjoyed your inflection there on your vote. That was a nice turn of phrase, and we look forward to your work on the task force. We'll move on now to our first report this evening, which is from the Internal Audit Task Force and recommendations for an internal audit policy going forward. At this time, I'd like to invite the task force co-chairs, Mr. Scott Baranowski and Ms. Judith Gonsalves, to please step forward with their presentation. And while they're getting settled, I want to remind folks that the school committee established the Internal Audit Task Force in December 2017 with the goal to improve operations, provide transparency, and improve the trust that district funds are being employed honestly and efficiently on behalf of students in our district. The task force has been comprised of experts in the field of internal audit and have been meeting regularly over the past several months to do a number of things. First, propose, as we'll hear tonight, an internal audit policy for consideration by the school committee, to propose an internal audit plan for use by the district, and eventually a staff person that will handle internal audit on behalf of the district, and propose a job description and expected qualifications for the Director of Internal Audit for the Boston Public Schools. I want to note that the district has worked hand in hand with the task force in working through a lot of the concerns that we've had with respect to the implementation of an audit plan, as well as a audit professional within the district, as well as the City of Boston and its audit function. As you know, or as many of you know, we're a dependent district, and we work closely with the auditors and the financiers within the city. So I'm delighted to have the co-chairs here this evening to hear about the culmination of their hard work. I know it's been a long road, and certainly you've been very much at work, not only with your professional lives, but with this work as well, with your colleagues from the business community, from the nonprofit community. We've had a student studying accounting from Boston College has been a member of the task force, as well as a number of Boston Public Schools grads, which I think we take particular pride in. And one of those grads is our colleague, Mr. O'Neill, who, as one of his final acts as chair of this committee, led the work in bringing this task force to fruition. And he continues to work on that, that issue at the national level with his work on behalf of the Council of Great City Schools. Mr. O'Neill, before Mr. Baranowski and Ms. Consalvis begin their presentation, I want to open the floor to you just for any further comments you might want to make in teeing up this presentation this evening.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will just strictly say it has been an honor to work with these professionals from the business, nonprofit, higher ed, community. As we said, we had quite a different group. They met in open meeting a number of times. Every single meeting was an open meeting, which was a learning experience for those professionals as well. But it was worthwhile work. They took it incredibly seriously to learn about Boston Public Schools. Again, reached out to the city chief financial officer, the city chief auditor, the district chief financial officer, the superintendent, the chair, and others to really learn what's the right way to approach this. And particularly, they had a nice mix of folks who have been in small audit departments that have grown. So they brought a perspective of how to, walk before we run on this. This is all about lowering risk for the district in making sure that our funds are spent as properly as possible, and having their internal controls in place to ferret out any abuse or problems with the spending. This is about being able to show transparently to our taxpayers and to the residents of the city that the dollars are spent as professionally as possible. And having a function like this in place will serve our district extraordinarily well, but it was a lot of work to get this point. So I thank the co-chairs in particular for their extraordinary leadership and dedication on this, which will become quite self-evident as they step through this presentation. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you, Mr. O'Neill, and please go ahead without further ado.
All right. Thanks very much, committee. Nice to be back, and thanks for the kind words. You took pretty much all of our thunder, but hopefully there's a few slides left that we still have some content on. Last time I was here, we were talking about putting together the task force, making sure we had proper representation, and just like with all good teams, this team was awesome. We had folks from industry, we had folks from education, we had former Boston Public Schools students, representation from larger institutions and smaller institutions. Just wanted to recognize each of the individuals that put in time and effort, and quite a bit of effort, as you'll see through our executive summary. We wanted to create a task force that represented the city of Boston from a civic standpoint as well as from a business standpoint. We also wanted to create a mission statement. We thought it was important to find a North Star, a guiding principle to keep us focused on what our task was. The number of meetings that we had were 13. I think that's still a lucky number, right? But 13 meetings so far in open session. And we did have some folks from the public come, and we were well prepared thanks to the folks at BPS with the open meeting rules. That was always interesting when we did have folks from the public stop by. We looked for and gathered information from a number of sources, both inside Boston Public Schools as well as the city of Boston, and then the community at large on the Institute of Internal Auditing, other school districts who have actual internal audit departments, and other factors that we had from our different companies that were represented at the task force. Our focus was, again, to find subject matter expertise and be able to provide the best of breed to make sure that what we were putting forward and suggesting for the Boston School Committee was in line with their expectations and provide those recommendations. So from an agenda standpoint, just wanted to talk briefly and rehash what our mandate was, talk a little bit about our mission statement, the details of the process and recommendations, and then open it up for questions if we could. From a mandate standpoint, there were three primary items. One was to propose an internal audit policy, including recommended reporting responsibilities. The second was develop a job description, including expected qualifications for the chief audit executive. The third was to propose an initial internal audit plan. And then the fourth item was an ongoing monitoring or advisory role to help the chief audit executive once they got started.
So thank you for having us here. As Scott mentioned before, once we had the team in place, we thought the next best place to start was that guiding North Star, which is the mission statement, which you can see here on this slide.
again, to enhance and protect organizational value by providing objective assurance, advice, and insight. And what the Office of Internal Audit will be designed to do is to help BPS accomplish its mission by bringing a systematic and disciplined approach to evaluating governance and controls. And in the internal audit world, that notion of systematic and disciplined approach is very, very important. So for each of the pieces of the mandate, we'll go through what the process was that we followed, as well as the recommendations.
So our first call to order was to focus on the internal audit policy. We had several areas that we wanted to consider, including relying on what was mentioned prior in the meeting was the great city schools, making sure that we had the information that was already identified by that body, took a look at what their internal audit recommendations were. We looked at the Institute of Internal Auditing for the model audit charter. We also reached out to and spoke with individuals from Seattle, Washington, and then did some research and found areas that had charters in Texas and Florida. And we also involved folks from the Office of the Legal Advisors at BPS and the City of Boston as well, to make sure that what we were putting down was in line with expectations from a Commonwealth of Massachusetts as well as City of Boston rules and requirements. And our recommendations are fivefold. The first, we wanted to make sure that we created a policy to stay in line with what is expected at BPS as opposed to a charter being more a part of an internal audit in-house department as opposed to a policy for an entity like BPS. We intentionally kept it at a high level, making sure that it could grow as the role and responsibilities of the office grow. And then we also wanted to focus on reporting lines. And the reporting lines were important. We wanted to make sure that there was autonomy in the office, but also that there was different avenues that the audit executive can turn to. So functionally, we are suggesting that the Chief Audit Executive report to the Internal Audit Task Force, version 2.0 of the Boston School Committee, and administratively to the Boston Public Schools Superintendent. This would allow the internal auditor to have the objectivity and enforcement to meet with who he or she feels necessary to meet with and report good news and bad news, if need be, to the right level, to the right people, and get access, unfettered access to the reports and records that they need to get. So that was an important item that I just wanted to spend a little bit of time on. And then making sure that there's roles and responsibilities outside the audit function that might need to happen to keep the ball rolling from a planning standpoint, but making sure that the office remains independent and objective. And lastly, being a dependent school district, as was mentioned earlier, making sure that at least annually the audit committee of the City of Boston is met with and kept in the loop, informed as to what's going on with the audit program and audit steps here at BPS. So any questions so far? Just keep rolling. We'll keep rolling.
We'll save the questions for the end.
All right,
Thank you.
excellent. So job description.
Let me cover this one, okay. So again, all of our discussions occurred in open meeting, and we considered two areas here in terms of job descriptions that were already established, that being the Chief Audit Executive of Seattle, Washington, and we did spend quite a bit of time on the phone with him just talking through how that school district is set up, how that internal audit department was set up, to kind of compare and contrast with what we were looking to do here. And we also considered some examples that our own task force members had as well. Again, similar to what we did with the policy, we had the legal advisors for BPS as well as the Office of Human Capital take a look at what we had pulled together for the job description to ensure that it would meet expectations and would follow a similar form and substance as other job descriptions for the schools. In terms of the recommendations, as I just mentioned, it's consistent with typical BPS job posting that you would see, and competencies and responsibilities are commensurate with the general expectations of what we would see for a Chief Audit Executive. So they're listed and they appear in the appendix in the materials. The key points that we wanted to raise here is the office will start as an office of one, and that will be the Chief Audit Executive, to hopefully expand in the future as the function starts to grow and mature. And it will also potentially provide assistance to the Boston Public Schools in reviewing policies and procedures. So this is one of the items that Scott had mentioned in terms of providing some guardrails around making sure that the internal audit function remains independent, but can also assist in some capacities where there may be resource constraints. We also outlined a number of what we deem to be preferred qualifications, and those are listed here on the slide: master's degree, knowledge of federal, state, and city school funding mechanisms, experience with governmental or public agencies, and a recognized audit designation. Again, those are marked as preferred versus required, so that we're not looking for that needle in the haystack, and that we get a good panel of candidates to interview for this particular role. And then in terms of the hiring process, we talked about this at our last meeting, and the suggestions that we would make here would be that the Office of Human Capital would screen the applicants to determine the best candidates for the role based on the job description, as well as based on their knowledge of BPS. Then members of the Internal Audit Task Force would interview those candidates and recommend a finalist or finalists for the role. And those folks would then be interviewed by the interim superintendent of Boston Public Schools, who would make that final determination and then recommendation to the school committee.
Okay. And then the last of our first three initiatives was to develop an internal audit plan. Again, these discussions happen in open meeting, and were assisted by our review of what was available from the great city schools from the fall of 2017. The general knowledge of the task force members as to the nature and extent of the audit universe and development of risk assessments and audit plans, and discussions with a number of individuals, part of BPS, as well as the city and various other individuals from KPMG, as well as some members of the task force and the school committee, Mr. Lecanto, Ms. Perel, and others. And we do appreciate your time and your help during the process as we tried to figure out just what makes up the Boston public school system versus what makes up the city of Boston, where those dependencies lie, to help us make a more informed decision as to how best to define the audit plan. And our recommendation in this case was to change what our initiative was by focusing a little bit more on establishing a universe would take too much time and would be a significant undertaking, and the lack of involvement from the chief audit executive would do a disservice to BPS. So our suggestion and recommendation is that the chief audit executive be involved with the development of the audit plan and help define what that plan should be, and that the task force should be better served by focusing on what should happen over a 3-year period, and we'll talk a little bit about what the measures of success would look like over those 3 years. So for illustrative purposes, we just wanted to give you a funnel, for lack of a better way of describing it, as to the complexities around developing an internal audit plan, where there are a number of moving parts. The more we spoke with different individuals from BPS, the more we understood how complex an operation that BPS runs, and everyone should be commended for keeping it running as well as they do. There were a lot of moving parts, and every time we asked a question, we learned more things. And so we're going to keep that to the experts, to the internal auditor, the chief audit executive who gets hired, and suggest these measures of success over a 3-year cycle. So the first 6 months, we see this as a time period to ensure that the chief audit executive acclimates to what needs to occur here, establish a risk assessment framework, gain an understanding of the organization, make sure that they're able to meet with key individuals in various departments, provide some education to their counterparts in different parts of BPS to make sure they understand what the methodologies are, what sorts of things are important for the chief audit executive, and then use those conversations to help guide where to do a deeper dive. In year one, by the end of year one, we're looking to devise reviews called readiness reviews, and those would be quick conversations, some walkthroughs, some testing of some key areas, developing some plans, and again, further refined communications and getting more involved and network with the internal auditors from the Council of Great City Schools. Again, the auditor, being a department of one, is going to need to be able to network and provide and obtain resources from other school districts to help get ahead that much faster. In year two, again, it would be more refinement from year one. We'd start doing some internal audits, refine the audit universe, do a resource assessment, trying to identify, should there be an additional hire? Are there interns that are available? How can we augment the group? Again, as Mr. O'Neill mentioned, there were some folks who were part of the task force from smaller shops, and we were trying to learn how to do more with less. And they provided some good insights as far as interns and how that could be working. And then ultimately developing a tool to track what's outstanding, what needs to get done, and to keep that to-do list on a move-forward basis so that things don't get lost along the way. And finally, in year three, that would be the full rollout, a full complement of the risk assessment, a plan, reports, a reporting structure, and involvement from all clients of BPS. And that would be an exciting time once that happens. So that concludes our remarks. We included some appendices, which are what our suggestions are for the policy, what our suggestions are for the job description, the 3-year time plan, and just some other internal audit documents that might help everyone better understand the roles and responsibilities of the internal audit function.
Well, thank you once again for your presentation and again for your hard work. I want to open it up to members for questions and discussion. Mr. O'Neill, I'll start with you.
Thank you. As a fellow member of the task force, first of all, I recognize to my fellow members tonight and to members in the audience, this is about the most dry, arcane topic you could possibly have. And we recognize that, and yet it is incredibly important because we are stewards of approximately $1.1 billion. And so I neglected to mention ahead of time the background of the two co-chairs that you have in front of her, but Ms. Judy Gonzalez is the head of global internal audit for Liberty Mutual, so in charge of internal audit worldwide for one of Boston's largest employers. And Mr. Scott Baranowski is a partner at Wolf & Company and heads up their internal audit practice for all of their clients. So between the two of them, the expertise that they have is phenomenal in this topic. The other members of the committee or the task force were just about all heads of internal audit. I do have to call out two in particular. Ms. Natalie Velasquez, who is a graduate of Boston Latin Academy and is now at State Street as a business unit specialist, I believe the title was, or something along that. And Mr. Jonathan Joint, who is a recent graduate of New Mission High School and is now studying finance and accounting at Boston College. And so they provided great expertise. I have to assure my fellow members that every word you see in front of you, particularly in the policy, job description, and expectations in the first couple of years, was deeply negotiated and discussed by internal audit experts. And I particularly appreciate their focus on this was going to start out to be an Officer 1. So there was a lot of conversation of, you know, you'll recall that that's the exact same way that the Office of Opportunity Achievement Gap started. And it could have very easily been sidelined, but Dr. Colin Rose has done just a fantastic job of having the work that he's doing be embedded and embraced by all his fellow senior team members. And so that power of his work has been multiplied throughout the district. And that was the roadmap for task force for internal audit. And how do we have the work of the chief internal auditor for this Boston Public Schools be embedded with the heads of all the different departments, and that they appreciate and accept the risk management role, and so that this can be done right. This is not about having a gotcha department, but in fact being a true risk management partner that helps the senior leaders of the district think about how to mitigate risk and be expeditious in their funding. And lastly, I am deeply appreciative of the work of Interim Superintendent Peril and Chair Lecanto in understanding the value of this and spending a lot of time with the task force in talking it through, particularly about the recommendations on both reporting and on what our appropriate hiring practice would be, so that you can ensure the independence of an auditor to be free to internal audit, to be free to do their job the right way. For example, Ms. Gonzalez reports to the chair of the audit department, chair of the audit committee for the board of directors of Liberty Mutual, and then administratively reports to, was it?
The chief financial officer.
Chief financial officer. So there were a lot of examples like that to thinking through the right way to do it, so that someone both has the power of the office of the superintendency with them, while also being objective and independent and reporting to us. So thank you both for your support on that.
Well, thank you once again, Mr. O'Neill, for seeing this through to fruition and being our conduit to the task force and really supporting, you know, this deep work that is so meaningful to our fiduciary duties as board members. Vice Chair Oliver Davila.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. O'Neill, for your work on this. Thank you all for working on this. And I don't have a question now because Mr. O'Neill basically said what was on my mind, which is the one staff person. And also, you know, I love my auditors, but, you know, auditors are auditors. Don't take that personally. But, you know, so how are you independent and at the same time part of the district? So you answered the question already. So just thank you for your work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chair. And you know, it's okay. Auditors get beat up in the same way that lawyers do as well. So, you know, I'm glad you guys are game just the same. I also have to say, you know, as someone who just took their child to see Apollo 11 in the theaters, I love the fact that this looks like a 5-stage rocket. So, you know, hopefully that's a metaphor for the good work that we'll have going forward in the district. But seriously, you know, I really, once again, appreciate the hard work and, you know, the deep dive that all the members of the task force and the two of you in particular as the co-chairs working this through. This is such a great example of business coming to the fore to support an urgent need in the public arena, and you know, bringing in critical supports all across the city from all sectors of our economy. It's really meaningful to us, and it's very comforting to have that type of support for urgent needs within the district. I also will note that you know, you're not going to be going away just yet, and very similar to our other task forces, you will transition into a monitoring role. You've been very active in meeting on at a breakneck pace, but going forward as we move through to post this position and fill it and get that auditor off and running in working on his or her plan of implementation, they will have you and your colleagues on the task force as a resource to rely on going forward. And so we're very appreciative of that. We know that sometimes the folks might change over time, but certainly the drive will remain the same. And so thank you once more. What we'll look forward to with our next meeting, which is next Wednesday, is taking action on adopting your recommendations as presented this evening. That's a typical process that we have for the school committee. We take reports at one meeting and then take action the next. So we'll look forward to having maybe one or both of you back at the next meeting to add this to our action item agenda and take action to adopt these recommendations. Thank you once more and have a good evening.
Thanks.
Thank you.
You too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll move on now to our next report, which is a report on state education finance reform. And we're very lucky this evening to have with us the City of Boston's Budget Director, Mr. Justin Starrett, who's going to step forward at this time with his presentation. First, I'd like to turn it over to our interim superintendent, Ms. Peril, for her opening remarks.
Thank you, Chair Lecanto. I also want to welcome Justin Starrett, the Budget Director for the City of Boston, to join us this evening. Some people see budget director, and I see legislation architect and advocate for ensuring that Boston has a fighting chance to access the resources that are warranted, that our students deserve, and that should be part of the state financing partnership between our state government and our cities and towns. So he will provide an overview this evening of the state education finance reform efforts that are going on Beacon Hill. As I think all of you know by now, I and others from the school committee have joined Mayor Walsh and other city and state leaders in supporting the Education Promise Act, which aims to provide more equitable state funding to school districts in Massachusetts. This is a particularly important issue for districts like Boston that serve a significantly high percentage of high-needs students. The current state funding model does not fully take this into account. This, combined with long-standing state underfunding of the charter school reimbursement, is leaving the Boston Public Schools and our 55,000 students woefully shortchanged. And the city of Boston has had to make up for that financial gap to the tune of roughly $200 million since Mayor Walsh took office in 2014. With that, I'd like to hand things over to Justin to make his presentation, and thank you.
Of course.
Thank you.
Good evening.
And welcome.
Thank you, Chair Lecanto, Superintendent Perrell, and the rest of the members of the school committee. I appreciate you having me here tonight. I know there's a lot to get to tonight, so I will try to make this as succinct as possible, but it is a very dense topic that I welcome any questions or follow up on. It is a complicated issue, and I look forward to getting into it. The first thing I want to touch on before I jump in there is we very much view state education finance reform as a shared advocacy opportunity. Parents, teachers, school committee members, the mayor, superintendents all across the Commonwealth are getting together right now to really try to figure out what the next version of state education finance reform is. As many of you know, the last time this was done in a comprehensive way was 1993, so that's obviously over a quarter century from where we are today. And a fundamental principle of where we are right now is that if the Commonwealth is only going to undertake education finance reform once every quarter of a century, once a generation, we have to get it right. The state has to get it right for every community, but especially communities like Boston that, as the superintendent mentioned, educate the highest number of low-income students, the highest number of ELL students, and the highest number of students that share those multiple needs categories. And we really look forward to a robust partnership with advocacy groups, with mayors from across the Commonwealth, with school committees from across the Commonwealth, and certainly superintendents from across the Commonwealth. So before I get into that, I thought it would be helpful to give a little bit of a picture of where we've been over the last 6 years and why education funding and why state revenue is a really important part of the conversation. So to set the stage a little bit, this chart in front of you right now, hopefully, as you can see on there, has a couple different things going on that I'm going to walk through. So basically, that blue line at the top is the overall state, City of Boston spending on education over the last 6 years. That includes both funding at BPS and funding for charter school tuition. In that time period, we are up over $300 million. And as you can see, the vast majority of that, about $200 million, has been directly at BPS, with the balance coming from what we owe to charter school tuition at the end of the day. And while the city and the school committee and the city council should be very proud of this investment, there is a troubling trend that is at the bottom of that page. And that troubling trend is that basically over that same time period, Chapter 78, which is the state's primary resource for investing in K through 12 education, as well as charter school reimbursement, has been basically flat. So in that same time period that the city has invested $300 million in our public education, the state has only provided us $10 million of that. So what that means is that the city's general fund, which is comprised of property taxes and local excise taxes and parking fees and everything else in the world that you think that the city can generate locally, has made up 97% of that $300 million increase over the last 6 years, which is certainly something that we're proud of, but doesn't really lend itself long-term to the financial viability of both the city and BPS. So that's a little bit of the framework of why we think it's a really important issue. As the superintendent mentioned, over that same time period, we've lost $120 million in foregone charter school reimbursement that the state has failed to fund. And that's a number that statewide is about $350 million. But obviously very concentrated here in the Commonwealth's capital. So I'll move on, and this is something that a lot of folks in this room should be familiar with. This is an issue that the state has been grappling with. So basically, 3 years ago, the state commissioned a commission called the Foundation Budget Review Commission to look at foundation budgets across the Commonwealth. The results of that commission were a series of recommendations that said K through 12 education was underfunded statewide by about $1 to $2 billion annually. That's a combination of both state aid and local resources. Since that time, there have been various bills considered on Beacon Hill to address the issue, but the state has failed to come to a resolution on a final version. The chart on the right is something that you should all be very familiar with, but is basically the composition of the district students and how it compares to what the rest of the state is viewing from a district level. And what this is trying to show is that the city of Boston cannot be left behind at the end of the day when it comes to the FBRC recommendations. And that's something that we've been working very closely with our partners on Beacon Hill to make it known that if the Commonwealth, as I mentioned before, is only going to undertake education finance reform once every quarter of a century, a district like Boston that educates the highest number of ELL students, highest number of students with a combination of needs, cannot be left behind from that equation. So that's kind of the basic framework that we approach the state education funding conversation. So unfortunately, what that left us with is the FBRC recommendations alone are not enough for the city of Boston. And what I mean by that is if the FBRC recommendations were to be adopted as is, we would not receive any additional Chapter 70 aid. And that's a very complicated and dense conversation. But basically, the formula punishes us for having a large tax base, but it does not reward us enough for having the types of students that we do have. So the way we like to explain it is we have the tax base of a leafy suburb, but we obviously you educate the population of a gateway city. And that's something that is an untenable situation for us, and frankly is why we've coalesced around this proposal to build on the FBRC recommendations. One of the other understated facts of what the FBRC will do, because it will, at the end of the day, grow foundation budgets statewide, is that it'll have a corresponding effect on the charter school tuition piece. Basically, if the state grows foundation budgets across the Commonwealth, including here in Boston, the charter school tuition is going to go up faster than it would normally. And I can be certainly happy to explain that to folks after the fact, but basically what that means is if we have a situation where the FBRC doesn't result in any additional Chapter 70 aid for us, at the same time our charter school tuition continues to increase and in fact will increase faster, that is basically putting us in a situation where we will be worse off financially than we are today and worse off financially than we would be if there was no FBRC recommendations at all. So what we had to do is we had to find a solution that's going to work for Boston and it's going to work for all districts, because this dynamic of not seeing any additional Chapter 70 aid with a rising charter school tuition piece is not a problem unique to Boston. It is certainly something that other gateway cities are feeling, other communities in the Metro Boston area, and certainly communities across the Commonwealth. So what we came up with, working with our partners in the legislature, certainly Senator Chang Diaz, is to basically pair the FBRC recommendations, which I'll get to a little bit later in the deck, and a guaranteed minimum funding level. So that is a new minimum funding level that we would be proposing in the Chapter 70 formula that basically accounts for the lost charter school tuition revenue that goes out the door before as a function of Chapter 70. So basically what we're hoping for is that with this combined proposal, because there is widespread support for the FBRC recommendations, is that the ideal legislation would result in new foundation budgets that reflect the true cost of educating students. So that's making adjustments for ELL students, economically disadvantaged students, health insurance like benefits to employees, and special education, with a new guaranteed level of funding that every school can benefit from the proposal at the end of the day. Because without this new floor, the City of Boston will not benefit, and we will not see any additional Chapter 70 aid from the state. So how the proposal will work is basically over the next 5 to 10 years, the state would phase in these new foundation budget rates, and I'll get to those in one slide. But basically, at the same time that they're doing that, we would propose to phase in this new floor so that by the end of the proposal, so the lifetime or the tail of the proposal depends a little bit on how much the state resources they can access over the next 5 to 10 years, is that by the end of the proposal, the City of Boston can rely on the City of Boston and BPS can rely on a more equitable partnership with the state, which right now does not exist. As I'm sure you've heard in the past, state revenue used to make up a much larger component of BPS's budget. Even 10 years ago, it used to be about 20%. In FY20, state revenue or state education aid that's available to the district is only going to be about 4% of BPS's budget. And in 2 years, that number is going to be 0. So that's basically the trajectory we've been on over the last decade, and something that the mayor, superintendent, the school committee, city council have been talking about a lot up on Beacon Hill. And frankly, this is the solution that we have galvanized behind to try to fix that situation. So the impact on districts, basically the proposal breaks down into 2 large buckets of who benefits from this proposal, because everyone benefits on it. There is a set of communities out there, and they are mostly gateway cities with low tax bases and a similar population to the City of Boston, who will benefit from a standalone FBRC bill. but there are about 100 communities out there, and they are cities like Boston, but there are also cities like Medford and Chelsea and Revere who do not benefit as much from an FBRC bill and only benefit when we propose this new guaranteed floor as a part of Chapter 70. This list is purely indicative of the many communities that do benefit, but there is widespread support for this type of bill, and there is widespread galvanization around the idea that if the state's going to undertake education finance reform once a decade or once every quarter century, it needs to include everybody at the end of the day. So I mentioned this before, but there are sort of four and a half significant components of the FBRC bill at the end of the day. The first one is properly accounting for health benefits. The second one is properly accounting for out-of-district special education costs and in-district special ed enrollment. Those are two things that have relatively widespread support up on Beacon Hill. The other two pieces, the English language learner increment and the economically disadvantaged increment, are two areas of some disagreement up on Beacon Hill, mostly because the economically disadvantaged piece is a significant piece for cities like Boston. At the end of the day, we obviously educate a highly economically disadvantaged population in Boston and a highly ELL learner population in Boston. So that's something that we have been advocating strongly that is fully implemented. There are a few different versions of the FBRC bill that have been floated around, and we sort of fully support the full implementation of that. And by that I mean properly reflecting both the cost of those students and the count of those students. Something that was a little bit of an unforeseen circumstance when the district went to free and reduced lunch for everyone was that we stopped collecting the forms that indicated whether a student was low income or economically disadvantaged. And when the state sort of had to find a new way to count that for the city lost about 10,000 students that were previously considered low income that were no longer considered low income under the state's methodology. The Promise Act and the components that we support fully support going back to a situation or an opportunity where the district can choose how they count students at the end of the day, and that could include either forms or other methodology to make sure that we know that there are students out there who are not being counted by the state system right now, and this proposal would make sure that they are counted, and certainly the funding would benefit Boston if and when we do find those students at the end of the day. So the last thing I'll touch on before I'll turn it back over to folks for questions is basically what I mentioned before. 10 years ago, the city of Boston used to provide about 80% of BPS's budget, and the district and the state used to provide about 20%. In 2020, that number is now 4%. The Education Promise Act, or the sort of the bills that we're advocating for that's going to create this new floor, is to get back to a new equitable partnership with the state. As many folks know in this room, in 1993, when the state undertook the sort of initial Chapter 70 conversation, it was all about a partnership between the state and districts. And unfortunately, in that time, in districts like Boston, but also many districts across the Commonwealth, that partnership has eroded. So what we're trying to get back to under this bill and under these proposals is a more equitable share for the city of Boston and the state to ensure that they are investing the same level in Boston as they should be, and the same level in other communities. So with that, I'll leave it, and I'm happy to take any questions. But there are a few other components of the bill, like properly accounting for enrollment levels, phasing in the proposal over the next 5 to 10 years, and then reforming the Foundation Budget Review Commission every 5 years to make sure that we are not only doing this once every quarter of a century. And then finally, data advisory, task force, and accountability. There's some additional discussions that need to happen at the state to ensure that, if they're going to be investing in a city like Boston, that it comes with certain data sharing and other opportunities. And if I can leave the school committee with one final thing, I know this was a lot, but is basically if the city of Boston is left behind from a financing perspective moving forward, we have been very lucky that we have been able to backfill financially all the lost revenue that we have from the city, from the state. Not that I'll knock on wood as the budget director for the city, but that is not always going to be the case, right? Macroeconomics and general economics say that there will be a dip in the economy at some point, and that's the point in time where we're not going to be able to both fund the charter school tuition piece, continue to invest in BPS the way we want to, in the way that that we have over the last 6 years, and at the same time fund the rest of city government, because that's a partnership that we expected to have with the state. So when I mentioned that in 2 years we're going to basically run out of state money, what they do then is they basically go after what is called unrestricted general government aid, which is another pot of funding that we get from the state, and they'll actually start deducting that to pay for the charter school tuition revenue that we have. And that's something that we see on the precipice in the next 2 years, and something that frankly was never intended by the state. That's money that's supposed to go to pay for police and fire and EMS and parks and transportation, all the other parts of city services. So this legislation is certainly key for BPS, it's certainly key for the financial health for the city, but it's also key to make sure that we're not robbing Peter to pay Paul, as I heard another guest say earlier. And that's what we would be doing essentially if we wanted to continue to invest in BPS, and that's something that why we're continuing to galvanize folks across the Commonwealth. There is a hearing on Friday that Mayor Walsh will be testifying at, a whole host of other mayors will be testifying at in support of legislation like this. And frankly, we encourage folks to continue to make the calls. I had the distinct pleasure of joining the superintendent on the BSAC panel a couple weeks ago, and that was certainly an excellent event, and we encourage that type of advocacy, because this is really something where, as I mentioned in the beginning of my remarks, students, teachers, administration, City of Boston, we can all be on the same page on this one, is because we want an equitable partnership with the state, and that's frankly something that we can all get behind at the end of the day. So I'll stop there, and happy to take any questions or follow up with more information.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Starrett. We've been looking forward to, for quite some time, to this presentation, because we know how important it is to the long-term financial health of the district and the city as well. This is also in keeping with our theme of fiscal responsibility tonight, between talking about our budget for the upcoming fiscal year, as well as some of the internal audit protections that we talked about putting in place just a little bit earlier. So without further ado, I want to kick it off with questions and discussions from the committee. You did mention BSAC earlier, and I think it's appropriate, given their work to date on the act, that we start with our student representative, Ms. Reyes.
Thank you. I'm curious, when you talk about the guaranteed minimum funding, like the floor,
Yep.
how can we be sure that we won't just walk along that floor, and that we will actually be able to rise above it in terms of funding?
Sure. So the floor is based on a city's ability to pay at the end of the day. When we talk about a floor, we're talking about the minimum amount of funding that the state should be contributing to our district schools. So for a city like Boston, we are relatively wealthy. We have a growing tax base, and something we're very proud of. The floor for us would be about 17.5%, and that's based on the combination of our ability to raise revenue here and our need of our students. But if you're a city like New Bedford or Lawrence or Springfield, your number is much higher. You're actually looking for about 80% of your revenue to come back from the state. Frankly, if we got to 17.5%, that would be a huge win for the district, and something that we should continue to advocate for. But that would basically result in a huge infusion of funding back to the city of Boston if it was to be fully implemented at that way. And that's the type of real meaningful progress that we think we can make in investing in BPS if we just get to that 17.5%. But right now we're at 4%, right? So we have a ways to go to get there. I think long term, we would certainly advocate for more than that, but I think just getting to that floor for the city of Boston is what we're really focusing on right now.
Also, in terms of that floor, is there a timeline for how long it will take us to get there if this is implemented?
Sure. It depends a little bit on how quickly the state can roll it out. So there's been a few different proposals, whether it's 5 years or 10 years or somewhere in between. It depends a little bit on the state's fiscal health at the end of the day. They're going to have to find the resources to fund this type of proposal. But we think it's achievable, and we think it's achievable without new revenue. And by new revenue, I mean potentially a new tax. We think that this is something that the state can achieve both in the near term and over the next 5 to 10 years. But the exact timing and when it would come back to the city takes a little bit of time. At the end of the day, this isn't about a windfall for the city of Boston in FY20. This is about putting us on a more sustainable path so that we can continue to confidently make the investments that we've been able to make over the last 6 years into the future. Because, as I mentioned before, if we don't get this right, we may not have another bite at the apple for another 25 years, and that's something I don't think we'll be able to withstand in that time period.
Another question would be, in terms of the impacts on the districts, I guess I'm not entirely clear if the benefits, for those districts that do benefit from FBRC, those stay in place if this gets implemented, or do those change in any way?
Absolutely. So they benefit fully from the same FBRC recommendations. And frankly, a lot of those communities, whether they're gateway communities or communities with large charter populations, they would also benefit even further from an FBRC plus a minimum floor, because they, at the end of the day, have larger charter school populations than, say, a suburban community. So this would also benefit them even more so. We spent a lot of time over the last 3 or 4 months working with other mayors and working with other finance offices to talk about the proposal, and it's something that we've gained a widespread traction on. The Metro Mayors Coalition, which is a coalition of about 11 or 12 of communities in Greater Boston, signed on to a letter to the House of Representatives and the Senate, basically supporting the principles that we laid out here today. And that's something that, because they realize at the same time that, yes, they may benefit from an FBRC proposal, they're going to benefit more from this proposal. And frankly, this is a better way to galvanize widespread support, as opposed to picking and choosing the winners at the end of the day.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Reyes. Dr. Coleman.
Well, great. I think in many ways you've asked my question, which is the political issues. You know, it's like I listened to Senator Warren about her policies, and you know, all of which I believe, but then you get Beto O'Rourke, which gets $6.1 million. So
Sure.
How are we going to, what's our plan for that concrete, move the ball at the political level, and who's going to be the barriers? I mean, who are the people we have to think about and convince them to change their perspective, that this is not a loss for them, and something a win for them?
I think that's a great point. I think the first thing we can do is galvanize around Friday's hearing, and frankly galvanize over the next few months, as this will likely be played out in the state budget process. The governor proposed this, a version of this in his budget, which does not go far enough, frankly, for the city. And we are actively sort of in discussions and conversations and trying to galvanize the support so that when it comes through the House budget process and then the Senate budget process, we are getting as much reflected of this proposal in at the end of the day. I think we have to change the conversation. This should not be a Worcester or Springfield gets less because Boston gets something. This is about Worcester and Springfield getting what's equitable for them, and then Boston getting what is equitable for us. And it doesn't have to be a us versus them conversation. The mayor and many folks on the city council and up at City Hall have been adamant that this should not be a district versus district conversation, a district versus charter conversation, a city versus suburban town conversation. This is about how we can find a proposal that's going to benefit all communities. And that takes some convincing, because there are folks out there who think that Boston has too much money. I would say I sat through the vast majority of the budget hearing before, and I heard a lot of unmet need and additional requests out there. And I would frankly say that this mayor is very proud, and as I'm sure all of you are, of the investments we've been able to make over the last 6 years. But there's always more we can do, and the answer should not be Boston has too much money or Boston is spending too much at BPS.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Coleman.
Yes.
Ms. Robinson.
I have a question. When the first funding went into place in 1993, how were we doing then? And then between 1993 and now, when did it start becoming clear that this formula was no longer working?
Yep, that's a great question. In 1993, we were doing better, right? We actually used to have about 25% of the BPS budget funded by the state in the 90s. That has slowly eroded in that time. There's two things that went on, basically. Boston became, frankly, more wealthy, and we had a bigger ability to pay, and that's something that we've been proud to do over the last 6 years, but then going back decades before that. And the charter school expansion happened, but it happened in a way that basically the state, as I mentioned before, walked away from its responsibility to fully fund charter reimbursement to the tune of $120 million in the city of Boston alone over the last 6 years, and that's something that has changed rapidly. I wasn't around in 1993 for the original passage, but when the sort of 2010 achievement gap law went into place, there was a promise that charter school reimbursement was going to go along with it, and that's frankly something that has changed in the last 10 years or the last 5 years, and that's something that the state is no longer fully funding at the end of the day. So I'd say that is one of the bigger impetuses for why the dynamic has changed. But frankly, it's something that we've seen the last few years. The mayor is previously proposed, thanks to a lot of work and advocacy from folks on this in the school committee and the city council, other ways that we've tried to tackle this over the last 5 years. But the way we approached it in the past has very much been a how can we find a solution for Boston? This was an opportunity with the Promise Act and some of the legislation that's out there now, is to basically take a step back and say, okay, how do we find a solution that's going to work for everyone, not just Boston at the end of the day?
So what happens with the $120 million that they have not reimbursed us? Is that just goes away and we're starting from scratch? And how do we make sure, even if we make new changes, that we don't find ourselves in that same situation 5-10 years down the line again?
Yeah, it's a great question. Unfortunately, a lot of that funding is never going to come back from a charter school reimbursement perspective. That $120 million is the cumulative effect over 5 years. I think Chapter 70 in a lot of ways is more of a sacred cow up at the State House, and it's a little bit harder to walk away from, which is why we think this type of proposal, that if done with the foundation budget review and at the core and sort of fundamental level of education finance, it needs to be done at the same time. That's why we're sort of trying to pair this new floor of funding with the FBRC recommendations, which do have widespread support, different versions of it, because we do think it's tantamount to get this done at the same time, because we cannot be up at the State House chasing charter school reimbursement on an annual basis.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Robinson. Mr. O'Neill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for your presentation tonight. A couple of quick questions. What is the total cost on an annual basis of the Promise Act? Do we have an estimate of that?
Sure. I would say that I'll answer it in 3 ways. One, the governor's version is somewhere around $900 million for the bill. We think the a House version of this would probably be around $1.1 billion. This bill certainly costs more, frankly, because we're bringing more winners to the table. But it would probably be in the range of 1.3, 1.4 billion. But that is not, when you're talking about a 7-year rollout and you're talking about a long tail on this type of proposal, is not astronomical at the end of the day.
Is that the annual cost of it?
That would be the annual new cost of the changes in the bill.
Okay. So, and you said the governance proposal is about $900 million. And what are we anticipating coming out of the House?
It's a great question. I think we'll learn in 2.5 weeks when their budget comes out. Maybe we'll have a sense of what that is, but it's something that we're continuing to work with them on.
And for those of us who are going to be lobbying folks on this, including potentially people watching on the audience as well as us, what are the main arguments against it?
It's a great question. I think 2 things, really. I think there is a real apprehension on Beacon Hill that the city has enough and should go it alone if we want to do that. And frankly, fundamentally, our pushback on that is look at our student population. There is no way that if the state is going to, with a straight face, undertake education finance reform, and that if a version of this bill goes through that doesn't make sure that the 55,000 or 56,000 BPS students are left out of that equation, then that is an equitable solution that people should be supportive of. So I think that's the first argument. I think the second argument goes to my point on where's the funding going to come from, and I think that's certainly a question that is rightfully asked. But when you're looking at the history of education finance reform and where it came in 1993, there was no identified sort of dedicated resource that was going to pay for the original implementation. And we think that not only is it achievable in the Promise Act or the idea of what is behind sort of making sure everyone gets something at the end of the day is unachievable from a financing perspective. We think that is achievable in FY20, and then it's achievable over the life of the bill.
So are there districts in Massachusetts that would lose out under the implementation of the Promise Act?
No.
See decreases in funding?
No. So the idea would be the concept behind it, or the basic premise is we shouldn't be pitting districts against each other at the end of the day. So we would basically be saying if Worcester was going to get, say $5 million under sort of the governor's version or a House version, this would all be supplemental at the end of the day. Now, I think some of the pushback might come from, well, if they put less money into this bill or they put less money into a version of this bill, we don't have, unfortunately, a crystal ball on what the House and the Senate are going to do at the end of the day. There could be some fluctuations, but what we can unequivocally say is that by the end of the proposal, right, when it's fully implemented, every district will be better under a bill like this than under a bill that does not include every district at the end of the day.
So if every district will be better under a bill like this, opposition by representatives or senators is purely anti-Boston bias?
I wouldn't say
Call it
that,
out that directly,
completely.
but
I would say that, like a lot of
have
cities,
large office towers, we're doing fine, why should we send money to Boston?
I think a lot of cities and towns are balancing their budgets right now. They're either going through their annual town meetings, they're going through their own city council process, and there's a fear of the unknown, I think, in a lot of ways, that if Boston gets something, does that mean I'm going to get less than what I could or what I should? And that's why we're trying to change the dynamic of the
And yet this is a
conversation.
wide coalition of
Yes.
cities and towns. And last question, are all of the Boston delegations signed on to this? Both the representatives and the senators?
It's a great question. I don't have that information on the top of my head, but I'm sure I can get that.
Okay, that'd be great to get both who is signed on and who still has concerns over it.
Sure.
You know, for example, I'm interested in knowing how my representative, Dan Ryan in Charlestown, and, you know, Senator, et cetera, feel about this, so, because I'll be on the phone.
Yep. Happy to
So,
get that information. for you.
Would appreciate it if you'd get us that information. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. O'Neill. Vice Chair Alvin Davila.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Excuse me.
Thank you for your presentation. I've heard this presentation so many times, and I still can't wrap my head around it. So my questions are more around, so I was at a meeting when you presented previously with a lot of other community organizations, which I thought was a good start to talk about this, but it is a lot to wrap your head around. And so I'm wondering, on the city side and then also on the BPS side, is how do we communicate this in a way that is understandable and easy, and, you know, like some quick bullets, and how do we engage and what things are happening? I know I had asked previously if there were items translated, and at that community meeting we also talked about how do we have community groups be like training of trainers and that kind. So how do we really engage the community, especially now with the budget pieces? I think it's good to talk about how are we doing a larger, you know, media campaign and really getting folks on board. And we know that all of us know somebody in Wellesley or know somebody, you know, and so I think it's conversations like you talked about, is it's not just Boston, it's how it affects everybody. And so how do we galvanize the community, and kind of what are the plans on the city side and then also on the BPS side?
That's a great question. I think we would be happy from a city perspective to share our talking points and our fact sheets and that type of information that tries to break this issue down a little bit. It is admittedly very dense, and it is a very complicated issue. The one takeaway that I think I will repeat probably ad nauseum is that if the state is only going to undertake this once every 25 years, and the solution that they come up with excludes its largest district, its highest need district, and its district that frankly educates a population that is much more expensive and complicated than the Wellesleys of the world, and we're not going to benefit from the bill, that's the kind of starting point that we should say something's wrong. We need to find a solution that's going to work for Boston, but everybody at the end of the day. And I think we would be happy to boil that down. And I think, frankly, we just asked the question to folks up there is how is this bill going to reflect getting additional resources back to the district at the end of the day? And if versions of this bill that go through the different chambers don't answer that question adequately, like we don't think the governor's bill sort of fully answered that question for us, obviously, we need to be asking how do we sort of advocate to make sure that whatever version does come out of the House and the Senate, and frankly the legislature at the end of the day, moves the needle forward on solving this situation that I have up on the screen right now.
Can I just make a couple of suggestions? So we had that community meeting, and then that's all we had. So I just wonder if this could be something that, like, the neighborhood liaisons, for example, could take on, knowing that they have ties to each community neighborhood of Boston. Because, you know, one thing is definitely to get this out. The other piece is when you look at the different pieces of legislation and you look at the governor's budget and you look at the amount, it doesn't really tell the story that you're telling now. It doesn't take into account the poverty piece. It doesn't take into account a lot of things, and it certainly doesn't take into account the accountability. So the accountability measures, which we don't have now, can have huge ramifications under the governor's budget for school districts. And so I would suggest if that could be one avenue. I'm sure there's more.
Yeah.
But I think getting those materials out, getting them translated, if we can also work with the citywide parent councils and BSAC and along with, all of the youth programs, I think I think there needs to be much more just conversation and media presence. I know because we're here, we're talking about it, but I feel, like you said, this is it's a critical, it's urgent, it's a one time. If we do not, if we are not up there on the mountain screaming and with a, what are those things called? Whatever.
Bullhorns.
Yeah, there you go, bullhorn. I think we are gonna be sitting here, for those of us that are still here on the school committee, it's gonna be very, very dire. So it's figuring out how are we galvanizing our students, our families, through all these different avenues that we have. Again, those neighborhood liaisons can connect with community-based organizations that are already in the neighborhood. I know I am part of the Greater Boston Latino Network. We're doing something on May 3rd statewide for Latinos to talk about this. So I think there's just a lot of, it's just asking people and following up from that meeting that we had at the city and just getting, continuing to get the word out.
I think those are great suggestions, and we'll follow up.
Great. And I'm happy to, call me anytime. I'm happy to help in any way I can. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Ms. Starrett, thank you once again for the presentation. I think the slide that you have on page 7 largely says it for, what the pathway is for us. There's so many other communities here that are referenced that, we'll see hugely positive impacts through the implementation of the Promise Act. And, that's really important to us in the sense of trying to put together this legislative coalition that we're looking for here. And, so to any extent that we can figure out other ways that we can work with our sister and brother gateway cities and other similarly situated communities around the Commonwealth, we'll be happy to support that. In addition to the youth groups and other community groups that Ms. Oliver Davila mentioned, we have the Mass Association of School Committees, Mass Association of School Superintendents, and a number of other groups that are out there advocating. And I'll mention that, there's a lot of groups that come out here, and this is for the folks that are watching, that, testify here every year about the budget impacts. And I know they're out there advocating around the Promise Act right now, and this is an issue that we can definitely come together on and join forces and advocate. The folks like the Boston Education Justice Alliance, Mass Education Justice Alliance, a number of the groups that's in whatever that new coalition was that we heard about earlier tonight. I think we can put those groups together and really get out there and advocate. One question I have, and this is something that you might not know the answer to. It might be a fool's errand to try to engage in an estimate, but do we have any time horizon that we have a sense of for when some act in whatever form to reform state education funding might come to fruition?
I think a general impetus at the State House right now is that there's a lot of advocacy to get something done as soon as possible. I think the governor put his flag in the sand, so to speak, with his version of the FBRC bill along with his budget. I think that there will be a fair amount of advocacy and pressure to do something in both the House and the Senate budgets upcoming. I think it's probably a little bit too early to tell until obviously we see what happens when the House budget comes out in April, what that looks like. But I very much anticipate that this is something that will get done in the near term, which is why I think we've really galvanized around getting something done. Now that's a little bit different than when the sort of additional resources might flow back to the city of Boston. That very much depends on how quickly and how many resources they dedicate towards implementing the version that they end up adopting at the end of the day. So that's something that we will continue to monitor and advocate for. One of the key components of the Promise Act is basically a yearly hearing where the House and the Senate and the governor will get together and decide how much that they think they can implement in that given year. And that's an opportunity to, again, galvanize support, galvanize advocacy, and get folks up there testifying, saying, we think you should be doing more to implement this bill at the end of the day.
Excellent. And, just to give a little more color to that, of course, the Promise Act and the other versions that we have up for consideration right now in the legislature, they're quantifiably different from where we ended up at the end of the last session. For folks that don't know, the legislative session is 2 years. We ran out of time, quite frankly, with the last session, and then the legislature broke for a number of months for campaigns and then to swear in new members. So now we're at the start of a new 2-year term. And rightfully, as you pointed out, the governor did definitely plunk down a flag in the sand to talk about this is the year we get something done, or this is the session that we get something done. And so a session is 2 years long. We hope that this reform doesn't take that long, and we think that there's the interest out there, but we definitely want to have our colleagues out there working on this and advocating for it. And pushing our representatives and our senators in that direction. Ms. Oliver-Davila, did you have something else to add?
I'm sorry to interrupt you,
Not at
Chair. I
all.
just wanted to say that you have an excellent point, and I'm wondering if, in this presentation, I think that's one of the things, too, that it's the levers of when and who to call or send letters to that I think that we also need to put out there. So, sorry to interrupt you.
No, not at all, and I think that's helpful to note. We actually, there's been some material that's been circulated from the city very recently that was used as an aid to suggest volunteers to go up to the State House on Friday, in addition to Mayor Walsh's letter to the community, which I just tweeted out a little bit earlier. There's some directions on how to advocate at the State House, or not directions, but just some suggestions. And we talked about those a little bit earlier. One would be writing to your rep or senator or calling them. We have a script that is a suggestion for how to handle that. Another would be to write to the heads of Ways and Means in the Senate and in the House. Another would be to write to the co-chairs, as we mentioned earlier, of the Joint Committee on Education, Rep. Peisch from Wellesley, and Senator Lewis, the newly appointed co-chair in that committee. And so to the extent that we can find that material and refine it down to share out, we certainly should do that. And I think that's a salient point. For a lot of folks, I think, government feels unapproachable, particularly when you get to the levels of the legislature, and it can be very confusing with respect to the idea that, you've got sessions that end consideration of bills, and you've got endless numbers of committees, it seems like sometimes, that hear these bills before they get to a point where they're ready to be voted on. Giving some folks a little bit of sense of empowerment around, what their civic voices can mean, I think will be truly powerful in helping us push this through. So once more, I want to thank you again for coming out here tonight, taking again what is a very big and meaty issue and distilling it down for us. I think we're still searching to try to turn this into a very simple elevator speech or some simple bullet points, but as we move through this process and we get more clear about what are the things that we really need to hit home on with our reps and senators to push this through, I think we'll arrive at that. And so we'll keep in close contact and appreciate your assistance. Superintendent, you had something to add?
Yeah, if I can just add to this, just on this notion of advocacy going forward, we have been working closely with the city. So the mayor convened in January a meeting of with myself, the school committee, and all of our parent and advocacy groups associated with the Boston Public Schools, so the Citywide Parent Council, BSAC, DLAC, others like that, when they were first announcing this bill. Since then, we've continued to be in touch with all of those groups. Justin mentioned our joint appearance along with Senator Chang Diaz and many others on the BSAC panel. This past Saturday, Representative Liz Miranda gave the keynote address to our parent university with 75 to 100 parents here, and I asked her to go into the Promise Act. We spoke about it again. We are coordinating with local superintendents. I will be with the mayor when he testifies Friday at the State House hearing, but we have also organized a number of our BSAC students asked me if they could possibly go to the hearing, so working with our team and our engagement team, we figured out a way to make that happen. So the students will be there with their own voice. And thanks to the Boston Public Schools, our Chief Engagement Officer, Monica Roberts, who's in the back, her community engagement team is taking some of the one-pagers that Justin and his team have developed and turning them into more actionable, very user-friendly flyers that we will ultimately have translated, but that we're using to equip people going to the hearing this Friday. So I think this concerted, ongoing effort is critical. We know many of our organizational partners and our labor partners are also helping to lead this charge. So again, it is a place where we can all turn, with one voice on behalf of Boston to make sure that we are maximizing the resources that the state provides, even as we work hard to be nuanced in how we deal with the resources that we have today. So, but it is definitely community organizing is in the air, so it's a great opportunity, I think, to raise our voice on this.
Thank you very much, Superintendent. And again, Mr. Starrett, thank you for coming out tonight and giving us this presentation. Before we move on, I want to recognize District City Councilor Kim Janey has joined us this evening. Welcome, Councilor. Thank you for joining us, co-chair of the Education Committee on the Council. We always appreciate your support. I neglected to recognize the Chief of Staff for the Council President, Andrea Campbell. Miss Ellie Pimentel was here earlier as well, and so I apologize for not recognizing her when she was here, but thank you for supporting the schools once again. We'll move on now to our final report this evening, which is the 21st Century Schools Fund Surplus Furniture Report. At this time, I'd like to invite Mr. Bernie Lynch, the School Building Coordinator, and Ms. Sue McCann, Director of Implementation for Capital and Facilities Management, to please step forward with their presentation. But first, I'd like to turn things over to our Interim Superintendent for her opening remarks in this very brief presentation.
Thank you, Chair Lecanto, and I will keep this very brief. This is part of the business, great product in, and then product back out is the theme of this next presentation. So as I think many of you know, over the past year, the district has made a major investment in infusing new up-to-date furniture into all of our schools across the district. It's known as the Build BPS 21st Century Fund to bring in 21st century updated furniture. This was an investment in purchasing 54,000 pieces of classroom furniture for all of our schools. And if you have been in and out of schools this year, you'll see colorful cubby chairs, wobbly stools, differently shaped tables, modular furniture that teachers and students can reorganize in a room on any given day to facilitate collaborative shared learning. It's wildly popular stuff in a lot of our schools. On the other hand, in order to make room for the new, we had to clean out a lot of old, now quite frankly, surplus furniture. We completed installation of the new furniture in January. It started last summer, completed just recently, which means that now all of the surplus, old, banged-up furniture is sitting in storage. So in order to properly dispose of surplus furniture, the school committee is required by state law to find that this furniture has exceeded its usefulness. So we actually need a vote from the school committee to authorize the school department to dispose of surplus furniture that was purchased with the public dollar. I would love to know when that law was passed and how long it's been on the books, just for a history question. In any case, we need the school committee to authorize the district to make this furniture available for other interested parties, which includes nonprofit charitable organizations. So we cannot surplus it or dispose of it without a vote from the school committee. So with that, I'll turn things over to Sue McCann and Bernie Lynch of the BPS Operations Department, who will explain the process to us.
Well, I think you've covered it all. We're all done. No. Thank you. Thank you for that intro, and pretty much covered all of our talking points, so I'll just zip through this. The mayor had put aside $13 million from the 21st Century Schools Fund out of the Build BPS allocation for a short-term, quick infusion of the Build BPS initiative, because there are schools, as we know, that are probably not going to see a large-scale anything for some time. So this was a way for us to shed a little love, I guess, we'll say. On slide 2, thank you, Bernie. This is an overview of the funding. When we were given this tremendous project, we had to figure out 2 things: what we wanted to buy as new and how we were going to take out and store and eventually divest of the old. So you can see that we've made purchases of, as Ms. Pearl said, bless you, 54,000 pieces of furniture, and we've taken out in excess of 60,000. It's amazing. And we had great pricing due to the volume of what we were buying. So it left us with a pot of additional money to do more work with the 21st Century Fund. The Build BPS, what are we calling them? The management group?
Planning committee.
Planning committee, thank you. Are going to be, we'll make a proposal to them, and then we'll figure out what the next steps will be to spend down that remaining money. So as Laura had said, in January we finished our installations. I'm off the wrong page.
So as we finish that work, we've left with the warehouses that the superintendent mentioned, and that work is driven by your vote in the consideration of the vote next week. The material is chosen by the schools. It's important to note that they chose what came out of the schools as part, same as they chose what into the schools. So it was very much stuff that they didn't determine they couldn't use at themselves, which we kind of carried over that other schools wouldn't be able to use it either. So, and our analysis of it and our review of it has come to that conclusion that it's pretty much past its worth to most users. But as the interim superintendent mentioned, there may be other groups that will avail themselves of this across the whole spectrum, whether it's local groups or international groups, but this vote would allow us to access those redistribution, reuse opportunities that exist across the country and the world. So we can plug into those and then empty out these warehouses in a timely fashion.
So to be clear, we actually did find some pieces that we've taken into our BPS storage to be used in the future. But there's a great deal of other surplus. So, is this you?
So this is the section of 30B that was mentioned a few times so far that lays out the decision that you have to make and determine whether the items are worthless and can be surplused out to others. So that's what brings us here tonight. And then as part of that, we're going to offer this to other community groups and other school districts across the state. And then through vendors, we'll offer it to hopefully to international or national groups that may use these type of materials. They fill up containers and they ship it to the, Ghana or other parts of the world. So that's pretty much where we stand coming to you tonight.
So we'll be coming back to you for an action requested that you declare that surplus furniture, fixtures, and equipment from the 21st Century Schools Fund have exceeded their useful life and are therefore of no further use to the district, and therefore to make these items available for other interested parties.
Well, sounds good. Thank you, Ms. McCann, Mr. Lynch. I wanted to open up now to school committee members for questions or discussion. Ms. Robinson.
Yes, thank you for your report. Can any of this be offered to families, thinking that there are many children that don't have a table or a chair at home to do their homework? Is it of, is it of the quality that it could be used safely at home, or is it really mostly?
Yeah, I'd probably have to rely on others for that. I don't see it being that useful. Plus, we have some limitations on what charities can receive the items in the law.
Okay.
Ms. Robinson, we can certainly look into this, but part of the
vote that you'll be taking, the authorization to disperse, then gives us the ability to make it available to local community-based nonprofits, as well as the international and national charities Bernie and Sue were referring to. So I believe that will be part of our plan, and through that, it is possible that it then makes its way to families. I don't think we can do direct distribution, and it's at a scale and magnitude that I think we're looking at agency-to-agency transfers, but we're hoping and we're looking into whether some of those can certainly be local, who can take advantage of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Robinson. Are there other questions or discussion?
Yes.
Ms. Oliver Davila.
Thank you. That's great that they'll be reused and recycled. I have more questions around, before getting to the vote, just around the actual vendors. So how many vendors do we have for the purchase of this 54,000? Is it a wide variety, or is it just a couple?
Through the procurement process for the $8.2 million, there were 6 vendors that were chosen. So the bid was broken in, working with City Hall and a lot of partners through government. We created the bidding process, which led us to those 6 vendors. So those 6 vendors were broken to different skill sets, whether it was the technology for the TVs and the monitors we bought, or all the way to the different levels of chairs. So we revealed ourselves of a lot of bids and very competitive, and we came in with the good pricing that you saw through those 6 companies.
And you mentioned that you have a planning committee. Is that planning committee, does that include teachers and headmasters in terms of looking at the vendors and looking at the type of furniture that was purchased?
The original plan included teachers. Mary Driscoll actually participated, members of the Bill BPS team at the time.
Great. I wanted to make sure. I just wasn't sure. And I think, I thank the mayor for this money put forth, because obviously it's very needed. My only thing that I'll say is just talking to teachers and headmasters that not everybody is 100% happy with the furniture. Some teachers have said, like, the wheels are driving them crazy. It's very disruptive. And somehow, even though that planning committee included teachers and headmasters, that hasn't trickled down. So with this $4 million, I just want to suggest that there's some avenue for exploring what has been ordered to date and kind of getting feedback of what the people that have it, what is their feedback? This really works, this doesn't, and making sure people can visit that school and test it out. And just, I think, obviously, I understand, we're trying to get a good price, totally makes sense, and get the most bang for our buck, but at the same time, just making sure that it's furniture that's functional, people feel really excited by it versus, oh, I'm gonna throw this desk out the window because it has wheels and it's disrupting my class. So I don't want to be negative, but I just want to put that out there that I've heard that feedback, and so somehow making sure if we have this $4 million, let's make sure we get, again, feedback and make a fantastic purchase.
Our next step for Bernie and myself is to create a survey.
Oh, good.
But we don't want to inundate the schools with, we might just do a sample population and to see what people chose, what they liked, what they didn't like, what they might have chosen differently.
Yeah, that would be great.
So
We're also going to do some audits, actually go out in the field and see it and touch it and get the feedback. Just more to close the loop.
Yep.
We've heard both sides of the spectrum.
Yep.
Yeah.
We've heard the same messaging that you have around the wheels. It's an interesting conversation, but I get
some
it.
Some people like it, some people like it.
But
that's great that you're doing that. So thank you for doing that, because I do think that's important. If that's a lot of money, and we're trying to create this really, great up-to-date space, and so just it would be good to.
Just one additional thing. Sue's working on. She may have working on a warranty package that will be shared with all school leaders.
Oh, good.
That will give them direct contact to each company and say, if you have a problem with that piece, call. So it's we've honestly been learning as we kind of come out of this purchase. It's a one-time effort, and it will grow with this extra savings, but it's kind of a new thing for the department. So we're going to build on that and share that information.
That's in progress right now.
Great. I'm glad to hear that. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Mr. O'Neill, you had an additional question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So thank you for your acknowledgement that
this is good, really good, but hasn't met with universal acclaim. And so the other feedback we've heard is, those balls that the students are sitting on and deflating, that type of thing. And it reminds me of the buildings we built in the 1970s versus the ones built in the 1920s. Sometimes newer isn't necessarily better.
My phone's filled with pictures of those bases just sitting there. I mean, we tried to fill the 21st century gap, and we're trying to figure out ways to fill that.
So what I'm wondering is, as we get a little bit of experience with this furniture, is there a risk that teachers are going to want to go back to the stuff they gave up? And would we then have given it away and now they're kind of stuck, so to speak?
We're really moving towards the future rather than going back. The items that we've taken out some of them are 20+ years old, and they scrape across the floor. And I know people don't like the wheels, but the wheels do help with the flexibility in the classroom and being able to shift your classroom around pretty easily. Long story short, we really are trying to discourage bringing the old stuff back in, because we've done such an infusion of the new stuff.
So is one of the ways you're discouraging bringing the old back in is by moving to get rid of it?
No, sir. There's so much that we kept what we can use.
Okay.
As schools make requests, we've pulled all that out, and the remaining is not useful to anyone within the BPS at this point.
And as we look to build BPS, in the next couple of years, we're going to be moving schools around, we're going to be doing swing space, we're going to be outfitting schools for temporary usage for 2 to 3 years, similar to what we've done with Boston Arts Academy right now.
Yes.
While they're in temporary spring space, while, they build a new one. Obviously, we anticipate doing that some more. Are we keeping some in reserve to be able to very quickly outfit a school on a temporary basis, similar to the senior income, rising seniors at West Roxbury Education Complex going to the Irving? Are we keeping some in reserve?
Yes. The
Facilities Management Department has not stopped doing that business while we did this purchase.
Right.
They stayed in that business on an everyday basis. We work above them and with them, not interfering with their daily work. So the school-based decisions about furniture and equipment are still happening on an everyday basis.
Right.
And that's driven through facilities management and Louise Donner and her partnership with the school. So we haven't changed that. We've hopefully improved that and decreased some of that, and we've heard Louise, but to your earlier point, if they need old chairs, then she has them in the warehouse.
We did save some.
So maybe it'd be helpful, at least to me, as I think about voting for this next week, in having a bit more detail on what is just described as 60,000 plus pieces of surplus furniture. Maybe a very high level what that consists of in some various categories, and how much is being kept by the district for ongoing needs. It would be a bit more detailed for us versus this is extremely high level.
Happy to do that. I wanted to add one point. With the infusion that we've made with the 21C initiative, if we have to shift furniture around to create swing space, if a school, the chairs will all match, the tables will all match. It won't be a hodgepodge of equipment. So that's one benefit to what we've done in doing the future projects.
And thank you. And the last question I'd like to ask Mr. Chair is, as we ultimately look to dispose of this, and after, local groups have a chance and everything, you talked about international, is there a way to designate, where we may be interested in having it go to? And I think, for example, the mayor was just in Cape Verde and mentioned that, which has a large population in the Boston Public Schools, and mentioned that they have tremendous needs. The Commissioner Finner, the fire commissioner who was with him, was saying that they're sending some supplies over. I'm thinking of, we have a large Haitian population. And so I'm thinking trying to match, is a potential to designate some communities overseas in need that kind of match our student population. So it would almost be of a benefit to be able to say to our Haitian students and our Cape Verdean students that, the furniture you used to use is now being sent to those countries. I don't know if we have the ability legally to do that.
So Sue and I actually talked about the Cape Verdean option from the news recently of the mayor's visit, And that, once we engage with the companies, we've already discussed with one of the bigger companies in the redistribution business, that option. It's a matter of them connecting with the charity. The charity's their customer on the receiving side, and we're the customer or the client on the donation side. So
I'm just
we can
wondering if it's
definitely do that.
possible for BPS to give a
Yes.
list of countries where a lot of our students come from, to kind of
Sister
give
cities, we could
priority.
go
It's
sister
just a,
cities,
it's
yeah.
just a thought.
Good idea.
Sure.
Thank you.
We can certainly do that.
Well, thank you, Mr. O'Neill, and thank you once again, Ms. McCann, Mr. Lynch, for your presentation tonight. I know there's been a lot of interest in this already, and I've heard from some local charities that are seeking this type of material to help supplement some of the out-of-school time programs that they conduct to support our students. And so the, certainly the aims of this program to donate, reuse, and recycle materials that still have a lifespan in them, they might just not be a lifespan within the BPS, can be utilized by people that need them most. So we'll look forward to taking action on this next week at our next meeting. Thank you
Thank you.
again.
Thank you.
Move on now to public comment on reports. Ms. Sullivan?
Thank you. We have no speakers for public comment.
Well, thank you, Ms. Sullivan. Is there any new business from the committee?
Yes.
Bedazzle.
Yes, I just, for some time in the future, just because we had touched upon the grant for the students from Puerto Rico, I just was curious, with the students that are here, if we could just get a report on how they're doing and what kinds of services that we're providing.
Yes.
That would be great. Thank you.
Very good, Ms. Oliver Davila. Any other new business from the members? Well, hearing none, that concludes our business for the evening. Our next school committee meeting will take place on Wednesday, March 27th at 6 p.m. That's next Wednesday, at which time the committee will vote on the interim superintendent's final FY20 budget recommendation. If there's nothing further, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn. Thank you, Ms. Oliver, Ms. Robinson. That's a second, and probably unanimous consent from Mr. O'Neill and the others. Good night. Thank you.